The Arnault Empire had only 2 weeks left before the wedding of the crown prince. All the aristocrats and commoners were delighted. People came from all over the empire to watch the wedding, even the young ruler of the Eastern Territory, Archduke Etzel. The maids whispered and discussed that the Archduke had not been to the capital, but they still knew that if such a luxurious, beautiful young girl came to them, then there was only one reason for this. They thought it was most likely a declaration of love. The head maid looked at her subordinates and said that this sounded like a big problem. The head maid asked them if they didn't know who this girl was. They looked at her in surprise and asked who she was. The head maid said that the girl was the central figure in the upcoming wedding. Stepdaughter of Duke Vassel, fiancée of Crown Prince Cassad Violet Heil. Archduke of the Eastern Territory, Cedric Etzel, looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she was looking for him. Cedric sighed heavily, thinking that he would have to tell the maids to keep her busy. The young lady looked at the Archduke and said that she asked him to marry her. He was shocked because the marriage proposal was so sudden. Looking at her, he said that he didn't understand what she was talking about. He knew that this girl was going to marry the crown prince. She said that she knew that her request was very sudden. The young lady said that no one else could help her, except the Archduke, and he asked in surprise why no one else could. The lady said that there was only 1 week left before the wedding, and no one would listen to her if she said that she did not want to get married. He looked at her and said that they had the power to destroy the marriage. She said that she knew a way, and he could use the right of merit. The right of merit is the right to receive forgiveness for any crime or the ability to ask for something just once. 6 years ago, the father of the current Archduke Etzel, while defending the prince at a hunting competition, lost his life at the hands of an assassin. The emperor therefore gave the young Archduke the right of merit in recognition of his predecessor's fidelity. The duke's only heir was then only 13 years old. She said that she did not intend to live her whole life with him as an archduchess, just a few years until she gained complete freedom. He said he was not going to ask her why she wanted to postpone the wedding while the servants listened outside the door. He said he needed to hear from her why she thought he would help her. He asked why he should use the right of merit, since they did not even know each other. The young lady looked at him and said that she knew a way to help him, said that she had been asking him for help until now, and now she said that she could help him. The young lady said that they could help each other. It was said that the Archduke had come to the capital to attend the wedding of the crown prince. She said that she knew a good doctor. He was particularly knowledgeable in infectious diseases. She asked him if this was enough to use the right of merit. A deadly epidemic is currently spreading in the Eastern Duchy. More than a month has passed, but the true nature of the disease is still unknown. He was surprised because the fact that he was looking for a doctor is the biggest secret of all secrets. He understood that even if she could guess about the situation in the East, how could she know such a talented doctor? He understood that nothing hurt and that he should try. He asked her how he could trust her words. She said that sending him a doctor first would be the best proof. He said that he could pretend not to know her after he solved his problem. She said he wouldn't do it because he hated being in debt. The Archduke said she spoke as if she knew him well. She said that this is something she would risk her life for, so she tried very hard to find this information. The young lady said that she had in fact already sent a doctor to them, and he should be looking into the problem by now. She said that even if he refused the offer, now if the doctor was successful, he would not be able to leave her. A moment later, a servant entered the room and called his master. He said that he had an urgent message from the duchy. The servant apologized for entering without permission, and the young lady thought he had come at the right time. A moment later, she said with a smile that she was taking her leave and asked him to contact her when he had made a decision. The Archduke looked at the service and said that he would listen to the message later and asked him to leave. He asked in surprise why a wedding. He asked if it was not possible to ask them for freedom with the help of merit. Violet smiled and said that it was because she was very beautiful. She said she just didn't want others to know they had any kind of arrangement, and she wanted to handle the situation as naturally as possible. She said that this was the most natural excuse to meet him. He fell in love with her at first sight and decided to prevent the marriage. The young lady smiled, bowed, and said that she would leave him. The Archduke asked her in surprise if he had really fallen in love with her at first sight, and she smiled and confirmed his words. Violet said that if they said this, then they would definitely be believed, since many people considered her beautiful. He was shocked. Violet said that he could tell the prince that he fell in love with her at first sight and wanted to marry her, and used his right of merit. Violet smiled and said that she would wait for good news from him, but the outcome was already clear. Archduke Etzel agreed to this marriage. She already knew everything about the infectious diseases spreading in the East and the Archduke's character. It didn't matter to her where she was, as she still couldn't get used to being treated like that. And also, she couldn't get used to this incredibly beautiful appearance. She couldn't help but know about this world, since it is a world inside the game. She was terminally ill, a disease that could not be cured, even with modern medicine, and all that was left was to die slowly. It was such a rare disease that doctors considered it merely a subject for research. Every day, every time she was in the hospital and lost the will to live, she learned about a new game in the strategy genre. The young ladies saw that the graphics and music were not bad, and the script was also well taken care of. In a world where children kill their fathers, and fathers sell their children, the game had every possible tactic in mind according to the concept. She understood that the game was to her taste. She wanted to use all the tactics. There were 3 candidates for emperor in the game: Crown Prince Kassad, Archduke Etzel, Cedric II, Prince of Edil. The easiest, as expected, was the Crown Prince difficulty level. 1 star, he had a strong position. The next candidate is the Archduke, a 3-star difficulty level, much higher than the Crown Prince. The Archduke's ancestor and the Emperor of Vengeance laid the foundation of the empire, so both received the qualification of emperor. The Archduke said that this did not suit him, handed over the position of emperor, and remained a vassal. From then on, the Archduke had rights on a level similar to the imperial family, so he had sufficient legitimacy as an emperor. The young lady understood that making the Archduke king was not so difficult. The situation with the second prince was completely different. The difficulty level was 5 stars. As the emperor's illegitimate child, born to a lowly dancer, he was completely discredited in terms of legitimacy. However, she knew that the more difficult the game, the more interesting it was, so she started a new game because she wanted to see how difficult it would be. 5 hours into the game, the doctor stood next to her as she was given an IV drip, and the young lady was in critical condition. She had to come up with all sorts of schemes and conspiracies to regain legitimacy, but the second prince was doomed. Not only his appearance, but also his abilities were at the bottom. It was his character that no sane person could have made him emperor. She continued the game ambitiously, declaring that she had to make this guy an emperor, but all attempts were fair. 10 hours later, her condition worsened, and the doctor said that if she continued like this, he would take her computer away. The second prince, over the course of several attempts at her game, lost the battle for the throne in various ways and met a bad ending. She was shocked and screamed that he couldn't end the game like that, because she wanted to end it properly. After all sorts of tricks and conspiracies, she finally managed to make him emperor. First, the second prince seduced the daughter of a duke with a strong military force in order to form an alliance. Then he had to cause serious trouble in the Archduke's estate, forcing him to withdraw from politics, marry the duke's stepdaughter to the crown prince, and use her as a spy. Violet informed the duke of the crown prince's current situation without any hesitation, and through her, the second prince was able to learn important information. Thus, the crown prince and Violet were beheaded on the same day the second prince ascended to the throne. In real life, she was sick and bedridden, but in the game she could do anything. Even though she saw the outcome in which the second prince destroyed the empire and her tyranny, she didn't care because it was just a game. But the moment she herself entered this game, she felt uneasy as she found herself in the body of one of her pawns, Violet. She thought it was a dream, but she had such a real feeling that even if she fell down the stairs, she still wouldn't wake up. She knew that if she woke up, she would suffer from pain and die. The young lady understood that now the implementation of her tactics must begin. She understood that she could be drawn into a struggle for the throne and be killed. Unfortunately, her marriage with the prince was already decided. The first way is to marry the crown prince and live as peacefully as possible. But the imperial palace is at the very center of conspiracies. The second way to escape is to get out of the capital, the epicenter of the storm. If she tries to tell the duke that she doesn't want to get married, nothing will change. The young lady understood that she needed support, because without it, she could not survive in this world. If her biological mother had been alive, she would have been a shield for her. Her mother was popular in social circles and had great influence. However, 3 years ago, she died in a fire, which is why she was able to so easily use the girl as a simple tool. That is why it is quite obvious that in such a terrible situation, the first person who came to her mind was the Archduke. Her ultimate goal was to become independent. Her marriage to the Archduke was only an intermediate step in gaining freedom. She understood that all the details could be discussed verbally, but she would have to sign a marriage contract like all the local aristocrats. Some time later, the Duke burst into her room. The young lady was surprised as he frightened her. She didn't have time to greet him before he slapped her on the cheek. He was furious and asking her what she had done. She knew that the Duke had worn a mask in her presence before, but in his haste, he had forgotten everything. Unexpectedly, she saw a pop-up window informing her that she was under attack and her life force was draining. She was surprised that she not only got into the game, but could use the system. The young lady realized that it was very convenient. The Duke said with fury that the Archduke had asked His Majesty to make her his bride, and had also used his right of merit to do so. The young lady was taken aback and said that she did not know about it. The Duke shouted with rage. He could not understand how the Archduke could interfere with his plans. The young lady was surprised that he acted so quickly. Vivian looked at her father and said that he shouldn't scold her like that because Violet had done nothing wrong. Vivian said that the Archduke said that he fell in love with her at first sight and used the right of merit for this reason. The imperial family is on its ears. The Duke said that after the Archduke had exercised his right of merit, His Majesty could not refuse the request. He shouted furiously that she was now destined to marry a country bumpkin from the East. He looked at her and told her not to worry, as the Archduke would arrive, and she could talk to him and dissuade him. The young lady thought for a moment, but finally agreed, and said that she would meet and talk with the Archduke. The Duke and his daughter beamed with joy. She understood that she had no reason to refuse, since this was an opportunity to officially speak with the Archduke. The butler greeted the lady who arrived at the Duke's estate. A moment later, he froze in shock as he did not expect to see such a thing. The maids in turn also greeted the young lady politely, but a moment later, they too froze in place at the sight of her. The young lady entered the Archduke's room and asked with a smile if he had wished well. She smiled and said that he didn't need to worry about what to say, since she knew she looked funny. He asked her if she knew about it herself. Violet asked if he shouldn't say at a moment like that she didn't look funny. Cedric said she looked different now, and he was being rude without meaning to. Violet asked with a smile if he really thought she was as bad as the rumors said. Cedric said that after their meeting, he tried to find out more about her, since you can't trust the future to someone you don't know well. Violet asked Cedric what her reputation was. Cedric told her that he told His Majesty that he wanted her. Cedric said a moment later that he hoped he had answered her question. The shrewd, sassy girl he saw, and the immature, quiet, precious child of rumor. It didn't take him long to figure out who she was. He understood that the Duchess's wisdom and ability proved this, since with the help of the doctor, she had sent the epidemic could soon end. She smiled and said that her family was very interested in setting her up. They wanted to ruin the marriage proposal by dressing her in an extravagant outfit, thereby spreading ridiculous rumors about her. Cedric noticed that her cheek was swollen. He wondered if the Duke had done it. He realized that the rumors that he loved his stepdaughter were also a myth. Violet said that the Duke was trying to force her to marry the prince by any means possible, so he sent her here to convince him. He said that seeing how obediently she came to him, she seemed to have a prepared response. She smiled and said that she had two of them, but asked him to listen and not get angry. The young lady asked him in surprise if it was true, as he answered quickly, so she does not feel the sincerity. He smiled shyly and said that he promised to listen to her. Violet was very happy as she liked to tease him. She looked at him and said that the first decision was to spend the night together. The Archduke was in shock. He was confused. She said that they were asking him, in fact, to sleep with her. He just needed to make others believe it. The Archduke was shocked as he understood that she was not joking. He asked her if this was too radical a method. Cedric said that, in other words, these are very bold decisions, young lady. You in turn understood that this is a game. If you try to avoid or use an inaccurate method, You will immediately fail. She understood that now it was not a game. But on the other hand, it was still a game she wanted to make smart decisions that would lead her to success. He said he would like to use the second method. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked if he would not even listen. Cedric said the second way would be better than the first. Violet said she thought the first one was better, but she would respect his opinion. She smiled and said that the second way was to simply lock her in his estate. He was shocked. Cedric asked her sheepishly if she was serious. He said that they were not that kind of people. She said with a smile that she was serious about it. She said that she was currently at the Archduke's estate, and that this was the easiest way, but it could harm him. Cedric said that her reputation would also suffer, but he could do it in order to repay her for the help he received last time. Looking at the young lady, he said that his reputation in the capital did not matter to him. She said that in that case, he could lock her up. The young lady looked at the building with a smile and asked if this was really the city library. She was delighted. Talon asked the young lady if this was the place she was going. To Violet said that she could call her by her name. Talon and Zen are knights of the Black Wolf Archduke Etzel, assigned by the Archduke as escorts to Violet. The Black Wolf is one of the 3 great knightly corps of the Empire, along with the Golden Lion and the Silver Hawk. Cedric asked the young lady if she needed anything from the Duke's estate. Violet said she didn't need anything. She asked if there was anything she said she needed, as he would get it. Cedric just looked at her with a smirk. Violet realized that he would not have used the most elegant method. The young lady told the Archduke that she had to go somewhere, and it was very important, and she was surprised that he had assigned an escort. They created the impression that Cedric had actually fallen in love with her and was risking confrontation with the Emperor. Zen asked why she suddenly decided to visit the library. Wasn't there another very important place that she definitely needed to visit? She smiled and said that it was all true, but she couldn't say, but there was a reason for that. According to the setting of the game, He Who Will Wear the Crown, there was a great advisor with the king who founded the empire. He recognized the monarch's authority and gave various advice to make him outstanding, thanks to which the empire was able to enjoy long peace. The advisor died, leaving behind a strange prophecy that one day his heir would appear and find the true emperor. People waiting for the fulfillment of the prophecy built a city in the place where he lived. The successor from the prophecy means the player. She knew that in the city library she could get this, namely the skill book. Of course, strategy is important in the game. In order to implement the strategy, you need something important, a lot of money, so the game gave the player 3 skills. The first is observation, where you focus on the person or object you want to check information about. You can see all the information about this person. The player can choose 2 other skills, but the best ones are creation and gathering. She knew that, to learn the remaining 2 skills, she needed a skill book. She knew that she was the only person who knew that you could get a book from the library. Talon suddenly recoiled. The young lady was surprised. Talon said that she suddenly had a headache. The lady looked at the knight and said that she just needed to find the book, so she could wait for her here. Talon asked the lady for forgiveness in a puzzled tone, and Violet slowly went to look for the book. The young lady understood that the gathering skill must be somewhere nearby. A moment later, she found the book that interested her. Opening the book, she saw a bright light. She understood that this was very good, and all that was left was to find the second book without incident. She was surprised because she was able to open the legendary level. The young lady decided to check everything. A moment later, pop-up windows opened in front of her. The young lady was a little confused, as everything was ambiguous. She was able to unlock many skills, but they were not clear to her. She knew she needed to find the second skill book first. A moment later, she opened the book and was illuminated by a bright light, after which the status windows appeared in front of her. She was glad that they were all legendary level, but unfortunately, they were passive, wondering if she could use them right now. She understood that nothing could be done about it, but still standing still, she would not find an answer. She understood that this was all different from those days when death haunted her, and her food became worse day by day. She knew that now she was living a different life, and she had time for everything. The Duke was shocked. He did not understand how it was possible to do something like that and imprison Violet in the estate. Looking at the young man, he said that the Archduke was definitely a real psycho. The prince looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what the Emperor said to this. The Duke said that since the Archduke had used the merits he had earned during his life, His Majesty could not influence the situation. The Duke said that for this reason, he would try to somehow force the Archduke to change his decision. The second prince said that, on the contrary, it became an incentive for him, and he decided to do something crazy, namely close it. The Duke told the prince that the Emperor wanted Vivian to become crown princess, and he could not object to the Emperor. The Emperor is of the opinion that marriage is a union between families, so it does not matter who the bride is. The Duke asked the prince what they should do now. The Duke knew that it was the prince who had asked for Violet to be made the crown prince's wife in order to use her as a spy. The Duke understood that the prince had to take responsibility, so the Duke called the prince. The prince angrily punched the wall. The Duke was shocked as he did not expect such a thing. The prince was furious, and he himself did not know what to do now. Until now, thanks to the advisor's voice, he had been able to lay the foundation, but it disappeared as if it had never existed. The prince knew he had to find him immediately, but he still didn't know how to do it. The prince wondered how the advisor would have gotten out of this situation if he had been in his place. He didn't understand why things didn't go according to plan. He knew he needed to find out what had changed. The prince in turn understood that he needed to dig in the direction of Archduke Etzel and Violet Hale. Cedric said that by signing here, they will officially become a couple. She was surprised because she saw a marriage contract. She was there to deal with it right away, but the situation was urgent, so they are only signing now. She asked how many people knew the truth about marriage. Cedric said that she in one night knew the truth. She said it was very good, because the fewer people knew about it, the better. She didn't want to increase the number. He agreed. Violet said that she did not need his power and fortune. She planned to live on her own money, which she would earn herself. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really going to earn money on her own. She didn't know what to say, as she understood that aristocrats usually lived off the taxes they collected from their lands. Only with this money can they live long and happily, so they are rarely interested in making money. Before the young lady could say anything, the Archduke said that he was also interested in doing business. He said that if she did not want this marriage to be questioned, she should behave like an archduchess. She was surprised that he wanted to trust her with running the household chores. She said that she could steal all the money. He said that he was sure she was not like that. She looked at him with a smile and said that since he said so, she would try her best. She understood that with the powers of the Archduchess, it would be easier, and she would be able to run her business at the same time. He sheepishly said that her room and his were next door together, and he would give her the key. Cedric sighed heavily and said that people might start talking about the receiver. She was shocked and didn't understand what kind of receiver they were talking about, since he was only 19 and she was 16. Cedric said that he was left alone early on, so the people around him want him to start a family as soon as possible. He said that everyone considered him a son, a nephew, or a younger brother, but not an archduke. Violet understood that he grew up surrounded by good people. She told him not to worry, as she could solve this problem. They were married for 3 years. She said that if during the marriage he liked someone and wanted a divorce, he should tell her. Cedric said that this would not happen. If it were not for this deal, he would never have gotten married at all. She was surprised since he did not even think about marriage and a successor. She did not understand what he was planning to do with his fortune then. Cedric told her not to worry about what he just said, as he had no intention of breaking their contract. He said that if she had a loved one, she could freely ask for a divorce earlier. She said that they were planning nothing like that. Cedric said that according to their rules, she had to have money cash expenses, and he decided to make them his salary. He said that this was profit from the lands of the duchy, and she could take the salary even after the divorce. Cedric said he thought it would be around 1,000 gold a month, based on his current income. She was shocked. Cedric asked if that would not be enough for her. The young lady said that it was just enough. He also wanted to talk about the wedding ceremony. Violet said that there was no need for that, and they could just call a priest and sign the marriage contract. Violet smiled and said that it wasn't real. Cedric said that if that's what she wanted, they could do it. Opening the box, he presented her with a ring that had been passed down through generations in his family. Cedric said that usually it is put on the bride's finger at a wedding, but they will not have that. He said that as long as this ring remained on her finger, she was a member of his family and he would protect her in the future. She asked if he would protect her, even if they just had a contractual relationship. He said that as long as she was under the name Etzel, he would protect her. Violet was surprised that she had a family as she had not had such luxury in her previous life. Violet said that as long as she carried that name, she would do everything she could to protect it. He looked at her in surprise and said that it meant he had a strong ally. Cedric asked her to take care of him. After they signed the marriage contract, the emperor was no longer stubborn, after which they were to leave for an estate in the east. The young lady was surprised and wondered what kind of archduchy there was in the east. After some time they began to move. Violet stumbled a little as she felt dizzy. Cedric looked at her and asked if she was okay. Cedric said that if she wasn't used to using the gate, she might feel a little dizzy. The young lady looked at him puzzled and said that she was already fine. The young lady looked at the vast horizon. In surprise, she understood that this was the place where she would prepare for a new beginning. She looked around the area with admiration, as she was struck by its beauty. Looking at Cedric, she said that these were very beautiful lands. The young lady was surprised, because she noticed that he had another expression on his face. Cedric in surprise. He smiled and handed her the confirmation of their marriage from the emperor. She was a little surprised she was not used to the new name and title. However, she understood that she would have to live for several years under a new name in a land unfamiliar to her. The maid was heading towards the newly arrived mistress. She told her friend that the mistress never leaves the room. The maid asked her friend if she wanted to take her some tea. She said that she also wanted to go with her. A moment later, two maids entered the office and saw the young mistress, who said that she had finished everything. Violet was delighted because she had done everything perfectly, and it was a huge success. The maids froze in place. A week ago, she took the place of the Archduchess Cedric, in turn introduced her, and said that she would be the mistress of the estate. Cedric introduced Violet to Nisha, as she was supposed to be helping her today. Nisha greeted the young lady with a smile. Violet, in turn, also said that she was pleased to meet you. Her life at the estate passed peacefully. Nisha brought the Archduchess letters from the Vassel estate. Violet was very surprised by the amount. The maid said that the Duke seemed to be very worried about her, and the young lady, in turn, smiled. The Duke tried to convince her in his letter, with all sorts of words he wrote, that he knew that she was forced to sign the documents. He said that if she ran away, he would help her. She wrote that it was a sudden decision, but now she is happy. The young lady in turn pretended not to understand the hints, and the Duke in turn began to brazenly threaten her. Judging by the content of the letters, the Duke is now in a bad situation. But she knew that it was much more important for her now to get used to this place. Archduke Belly's men were either surprised by her appearance or wary of her actions. In percentage terms, the latter were much more numerous. She knew that this problem would go away on its own if she handled her responsibilities. The Archduke had a large territory and rich resources. However, these lands were almost entirely dependent on agriculture. Therefore, they suffered greatly from crop failure and epidemics. Studying all the information, she took this into account. She understood that if she wanted to make a lot of money, she needed to turn to trade or industry. The young lady, alas, had no understanding of agriculture, since the Duke had commercial success. His main products were various potions, which in turn sold out instantly, and the recipes for these potions were kept secret, so that only the Duke himself could prepare them. She knew it would be nice if they could do something like that. She wanted to come up with a potion that you could drink and make a person smell nice, or a potion that would improve the condition of your hair. A moment later, she looked in surprise at the window that had appeared in front of her. The young lady was in shock. She didn't understand what was happening. She wrote down all her ideas with lightning speed. She didn't understand what she was doing at all. The young lady was very surprised because she wrote down the recipe for making a potion. Now she understood how to use her skill, but she was puzzled because the materials were too expensive and it was not profitable. She sighed heavily and said there was no commercial potential. However, she realized that understanding how to use the skill was a wonderful achievement. Now she just needed to improve it to a more practical ground. After some time, she succeeded. She realized that the time and materials were right, and now it was time to make detailed installations. The young lady was very happy as this was her success. However, she didn't understand why she felt so dizzy. A moment later, she fell unconscious as her skill required a lot of energy. The maids were in shock. They did not expect that the mistress would fall. They shouted that they needed to call a doctor. Violet was a little confused, as this was the first time she had fainted in her new body. A moment later, the maid called her, and the young lady threw out all unnecessary thoughts. The maid approached her mistress and asked if she was awake. The maid told the mistress that she had slept for half a day, and the Archduke was very worried about her. The young lady was touched by his concern, but she still knew that it was simply impossible. She understood that if he really cared about her, he would express it not with words but with actions. Violet wanted to get up and sit up, but a moment later, shocked, she froze in place. She was shocked because she saw a wolf in her bed. The young lady looked at the maid and asked, puzzled, what the wolf was doing here. Nisha said that the black wolf is the symbol of Etzel. That's why there are so many of them on the estate, and this one grew up on the estate and doesn't bother people. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if it was true. Violet stared at the wolf. She was a little surprised, but she had already calmed down as she realized that he would not harm her. A moment later, the wolf stretched out and lay down on her legs. Violet was shocked because she realized that he was just a cutie. The maid said that the previous Archduchess loved him very much, and he could not get used to the time when he slept in her room. Nisha told the mistress not to be too strict with him if he suddenly climbed into her bed. The young lady was surprised that he had been living here since the time of the previous Duchess. The Archduke died defending the Emperor, and the Archduchess, shocked by the loss, died after him. It happened when Cedric was 10 years old. The young lady thought he must be over 6 years old, but he looked very young. Nisha said that when he lies down, he seems small, but otherwise he is already big. Violet asked if he has a name. Nisha said it was up to her to decide what to call him. Lady knew she had no talent for coming up with names, but for some reason she remembered Cedric. The Archduchess said that she would call him Sid Nisha, asked if this nickname was really from the Archduke's name. Violet said that the wolf's fur color was very similar to the Archduke's hair color. She asked if there was something that he might not like. Nisha smiled and said that he was not such a narrow-minded person as to hate such things. The young lady thought for a moment, as she knew nothing about the Archduke. He was different from the one she knew from the game, but he hid his inner world behind his stony expression. His expression is impassive, looking more tired than cold, so it's completely unclear what he's thinking. Cedric looked at his wife and asked if her body was fully restored. The young lady looked at him and said with a smile that everything was restored thanks to him. Cedric looked at the young lady and said that they could sit down and talk. They sat silently on the bench for some time. The young lady looked at him and said that she had fainted, but in fact, her health was not so weak. The Archduke looked at her intently and said that he understood everything, and that was very good. He looked at her with a keen gaze and said that he heard that she had been busy lately, looking for work on the estate. Violet gave him the recipe for the potion. He said that he knew that the Duke was famous for his potions, but he didn't think that she knew how to make them too. The young lady just smiled. She had not studied earth cooking, and it was difficult to explain, but it was all thanks to skills. She looked at him and asked, "How about starting a business making and selling potions?" She said she had a lot of ideas, but no foundation to start with, so she wanted him to be her partner. The duchy requires labor to prepare potions, so many new jobs will be created. They haggled for a while about how they would divide the proceeds, but after a while, they came to an agreement. Cedric asked her if she had come up with a sales method. She told him not to worry, as she had a plan. The young lady looked at her husband with a keen gaze, as she wanted to tell him something. A moment later, she said that there had been a black wolf in her bed yesterday. She asked if she could call him Sid. She said his name came from Cedric, because his fur was the same color as his hair. Violet asked him if she could call him that. Cedric was shocked by such a statement. The Archduke, in turn, froze in bewilderment. He did not know what to answer. Violet called him, but he did not answer. A moment later, he cast all his thoughts aside, as he realized that she was calling him. Cedric looked at his wife and asked if she was talking about a small black wolf. She smiled and said that it was true. She thought that, since the previous Archduchess had taken such good care of him, it meant she knew him. Violet said that Nisha said that the Archduke would not forbid them to call him that. Cedric sighed heavily and said that she could do as she wanted. The young lady smiled and thanked him. She said that Sid would probably be delighted too, and Cedric in turn said with a smile that he probably would be. The maid slowly entered the room with a candle in her hand. A moment later, someone called her, and she looked into the distance, puzzled, because she was scared. She looked at the Archduke and said that he had something to tell her since he had called her. Cedric in turn looked intently at the maid. He said that it was faster this way. Nisha was a little puzzled. She said that there are times when method is more important than speed. She looked at him in surprise and asked with a smile if she had done something wrong. She asked how she could stop him from jumping onto the mistress's bed. Cedric said she knew that when he transformed into that species, his instincts became stronger. He said he was so sleepy that he was out of his mind, so he climbed onto the bed. He told her not to put too much pressure on the baby. Cedric said he didn't want their circumstances to be a burden to her. Nisha said with a smile that he didn't want to burden her, but he still married her. The Archduke was shocked by the maid's statement. A moment later, his expression changed, and looking at her, he told her not to put pressure on the mistress, as this was an order. After Cedric officially became Archduke, he went through all the books containing the records for 6 years. Violet looked at the servant and asked if these were all the notes. The servant smiled and said that everything was correct. Those in charge of governance in the duchy were delighted. They said that their lady was simply incredible, as she had done a very good job. The young lady was very glad that they had finally managed to get everything done. She noticed that their relationship was different from what it had been when she first arrived. They were surprised when she said that she wanted to review the entire accounting as there were a lot of documents. The young man asked the lady with a smile if he would just give her a brief report for the last 3 months. The Archduchess smiled and said that they had done a very good job. The young lady realized that she needed to move on to fulfilling her duties. The young man looked at her and asked with a smile if she would like to go to a cocoa farm. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she had ever spoken about this. The young man smiled and said that it was not so. He said that the Archduke had already given his permission. The young man said that the Archduke wanted her to go on a tour of the cocoa farm as soon as they finished, so they had already prepared everything. The young lady was a little surprised. She did not know whether this was concern on the part of the Archduke or whether he was simply testing her. The notes were well organized, so it was necessary to check whether their contents matched. She understood that it was better to see everything with her own eyes. So it was decided to first take a short tour. The first place was a cocoa farm. Cocoa and its derivatives were the flagship product, accounting for half of the duchy's income, and were similar to modern cocoa. After the fruits were picked, the seeds were removed and processed into chocolate. Because it was too expensive, the aristocracy was the main consumer group. However, books have recorded that cocoa production has declined significantly in recent times. The young lady was very puzzled by this fact and understood that this could not be allowed to happen. She understood that if the duchy's income fell, her earnings would fall along with it. She understood that since her husband had said that she would be given a salary, and a very good one by today's standards, she had to do everything possible. The young lady understood that now they were in the same boat. She said she just couldn't leave it like that and needed to go right now. The young lady looked at the assistant and asked if the farm was nearby. He smiled and said that the farm was nearby, and even very close. The young lady was very surprised, as the weather was simply magnificent. Zen smiled and told the lady that thanks to her, he was able to leave the training. The young lady certainly understood that she needed to be accompanied outside the estate, but she knew that he was a knight of one of the 3 great knightly companies of the empire, and she wondered if it wasn't a waste of manpower. But she was pleased by the fact that he was having fun. Looking at the men present, Violet said with a smile that they should go. The young man said that the harvest looked very bountiful. He sighed heavily and said that due to the epidemic, the workforce had decreased, and for some time no one had harvested cocoa at all. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that she had heard that the cocoa yield had been falling since then. The young man said that first we need to look at the fruit. Violet was surprised, because the seeds were small compared to the pulp. She wondered if they used the seeds and threw the rest away. Zen tried to bite into the pulp. The young lady looked at him and asked what the pulp tasted like. Zen said that she could try it too. She thanked him. The lady was surprised, because the texture was like a tangerine, but it was sweet and aromatic, but not sour. She was surprised because she found it very tasty. Violet asked the assistant if they really throw away all the pulp and use only the seeds. He said that the pulp often spoils during transportation. If you sell the whole raft, it will spoil less, but the seeds are much more profitable to sell. She wondered if she should create something like a refrigerator cart, but she realized the production costs would be too high. She looked at them in surprise and asked what was wrong with the seeds. A moment later, she accidentally broke the family in her hands. She asked the assistant in surprise if they had always been so brittle. The young man sighed heavily and said that this was the problem. He said that it did not look like a drought, but in recent years there had been a significant decrease in rainfall, due to which the pulp had become sweet, and this happened because the seeds did not have enough moisture. The young lady understood that for this reason the Archduke was very worried. She understood that, as they say, this is a matter of nature and not within the realm of human control, but she still wanted to try to do what a person can do. She looked at the assistant and said that they could raise the price. The assistant said that another family was also selling cocoa. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if they could negotiate with the other family and raise the price together. He said that most likely he would try to take away their business partner. Sometime later, there was a commotion in the city. The man said that they came here to buy a lot of cocoa, the lands of Count Belote, the second largest cocoa producer in the empire. The men were shocked they froze in place. The man said that they loved cocoa so much that they came here from across the sea in Cappadocia to buy cocos. The man looked puzzled and told them to wait because they were currently having problems even with internal orders, so they couldn't take another order. The man quietly whispered something to his master, who in turn listened to his subordinate with a smile. A moment later, he offered a shocking price. The man froze in bewilderment. He was shocked by the offer. A moment later, the men were whispering among themselves. They were talking among themselves in confusion and recalling the price at which they were currently selling their goods and calculating how much profit they would receive from the new order. They were shocked to realize that if this was a long-term partnership, they would receive a lot of profit, something they had never received before. The man said that he wanted to buy many kilograms from them. The men were shocked. They understood that wealth was now pouring down on them. They were so shocked that they couldn't even calculate how much profit they would get from such an order. They whispered among themselves for a while, because they understood that they wanted to buy the volume of products that they collected for an entire year. They understood that, before he realized that this was an outrageous robbery, they first needed to draw up a contract. The man smiled and asked if he was sure of his solvency. The buyer in turn smiled and said that he would certainly pay everything. Sometime later, they signed a contract. The assistant smiled and said that they had bought all of Count Belote's cocoa. Violet was undoubtedly pleased. She smiled and said that this was very good, since now all the cocoa in the empire was in their hands. The assistant looked at her in surprise and asked what they would do with the price. She smiled a sinister smile and said that they could set the price at 130 per kilogram. The assistant was a little puzzled, but also supported her idea. The assistant said it was very common, but they would have no choice but to buy. The young lady, with a cheesemaker's grin, said that this was the reason the monopoly was so dangerous. In any case, the main consumers of chocolate are aristocrats. The higher the price, the higher the demand. The young lady thought for a moment. Looking at the assistant, she said that she would like to sell the pulp too. The percentage of pulp is much higher than that of seeds, and as long as the weather is good, the taste will also be better. The assistant looked at her and said that, as he had told her earlier, there was a problem with transportation and storage. She looked at him and said that first, they both needed to be processed into pulp and only then sold. In Korea, people who traveled abroad always bought dried mangoes. Violet knew that they could also make jam, but sugar was very expensive in this world, so it would be better if they dried the pulp. The young lady understood that since she had a brilliant idea, she could immediately make a recipe. The assistant looked at her in surprise and bewilderment. A moment later, the perfect plan was written on paper. The assistant was in shock. The young lady sighed heavily as she had succeeded, and she realized that her skill had also become more familiar than last time. She handed the recipe sheet to her assistant and told him to try to cook everything exactly as the recipe stated. A moment later, someone called her, and she looked at the maid in surprise. The maid said that a man from the capital had come to see her. Violet was surprised, as she was not expecting anyone. The maid said that her biological father had come to visit her. The maid said that Earl Hill had brought his army and set up camp in front of Archduke's land. Violet knew that Earl Hill was the third husband of the real Violet's mother. Violet's mother was named Lady Adeline. She was a beautiful socialite. Lady Adeline was married only 4 times. Isaac Hill was Adeline's third husband, Violet's stepfather, and a close friend of Violet's biological father, making Violet the closest to Isaac Hill among her stepfathers. But there has been no news about him lately. Hill looked at the young lady and said that they could return to the capital right now. He said angrily that he should never have given her over to the Duke's care. He said he should never have believed the promise that he would look after her as his own daughter. Hill said he should have raised her himself. The young lady was surprised, because as a man who had lived his entire life on the battlefield, he was straightforward. She looked at him and said that she was perfectly fine and would stay here. Hill looked at her in surprise and asked what she was saying, asking if she had really been threatened by that grim, creepy guy to make her say that. Hill said that he must have stolen her, who had just come of age, and threatened her a lot. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she realized how rumors were circulating in their capital. Hill angrily told her to immediately tell him what he had told her, and he would certainly support her. The young lady thought for a moment she did not know what to say. A moment later, she said with a smile that first he entrusted her with all the documents. He also gave her the key to the warehouse and told her to use all the salary as she wanted. She also said that he agreed with everything and allowed her everything. Hill was shocked. Violet smiled and said that her husband was a great man. Hill was furious. Hill shouted furiously that she should have become a princess. The young lady said with a smile that she did not want this at all, as the empire was too heavy a burden for hers. They stood in silence for a while, looking at each other. Hill sighed heavily and said that her mother would have said the same thing, because what she loved most was freedom. He said that he had completely forgotten about that. The young lady was a little surprised, as she understood that the Count was indeed a very naive person. In the game, Isaac was on the side of the Crown Prince. When Ediel was enthroned, his existence as a war hero became burdensome. Then she forced this man to disobey the imperial order. The enraged emperor sent the Count to the battlefield, from where he could never return alive, where he eventually died, a part of the game that was explained with just a few lines of dialogue. The Count said angrily that he must verify everything she said himself. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. The Count said he had to check whether he had married her to use her or for love. The Count said that if it turned out that the Archduke was using his daughter, he would never forgive him. She looked at him in surprise, and the Count asked if she was embarrassed by such a father. After she became incurably ill and was hospitalized, her parents never visited her. Such perfect people could not have given birth to such a defective daughter, and she never heard words like those the Count said. The Count said that he was probably a worthy man, in the form of a duke. She quietly said that she hated him. The Count looked at her in surprise. She said that she never thought of him as her father. Looking at the Count, she said with a smile that she really didn't know at all what kind of creature a father was. She looked at him and said that, "Oh, but a person like him, who can be a support and care for much better than that two-faced man." He smiled and said that in that case, he will reveal all the dark nature of that guy. The young lady looked at the Archduke and asked if he played well. He looked at her in surprise. Violet said that Count Hill would like to see him. She said that the Count said that he wanted to check if he really loved her. Violet looked at us in the segment and said that therefore he needed to pretend that he liked hers. Violet wondered if he could do it, as he always seemed like an unfeeling person to her. Cedric thought for a moment about what she said. Cedric asked if the Earl was her stepfather. She smiled and said that that was exactly it, and he was the closest of all the others. Cedric said that if that was the case, then that was a good enough reason for him to try, and he would certainly do everything in his power. The young lady looked at the Archduke with surprise and embarrassment, as she did not expect such a reaction. She looked at him closely and said that he didn't seem to have a talent for pretense, especially when it came to love. Cedric said that in all his life he had never heard that he was bad at anything. Violet looked at him and said with a smile that it would be rather rude to say that. Cedric said that it was the first time he had heard anyone say something like that to his face. Violet looked at him and said with a smile that most likely everyone wanted to say it, but held back. She looked at him intently and asked if he had ever loved. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was strange that she was asking about this. Violet looked at her husband in surprise and said that it was not strange at all. He looked at her and said that he was 19 and she was 16. He asked if he didn't have more opportunities. The young lady frowned. The young lady was furious as her real body was 23, but she still knew that she could not say anything. She has no dating experience because she's only ever been in the hospital, but she had a lot of indirect experience from watching dramas and movies and books. But she knew she couldn't say it looking at the Archduke. She asked if he had forgotten that she was Lady Adelida's daughter. The Archduke looked at her and said that this was all indirect experience, but it was also a good inheritance. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really had experience. The Archduke in turn looked at her intently and remained silent. But a moment later, he slowly approached her. The young lady was shocked as he came very close to her. The Archduke approached her face and called her the young lady, froze in place in embarrassment. He smiled looking at her and said that somehow this is how it should be done. Violet was shocked, and at the same time very confused as she realized that this was how he used his face. He looked at her and with a sly smile asked if this kind of communication with her would be suitable. The young lady froze in place with embarrassment and said puzzled that it was gorgeous. Cedric said with a smile on his face that since they were finished with training, he should go and greet him. He said that he would definitely talk to the Count. The young lady stood up and thanked him for his concern and asked who it was. Cedric looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She said that she was talking about the man to whom he gave his love. Cedric smiled and said that it was Aline. She was a very small and cute female. Violet looked at him in surprise. The Archduke said it was a rabbit, and he raised her when he was little. Violet was shocked that he mistook her for a rabbit. She looked at him in surprise and asked who was looking at a rabbit like that. Cedric asked, in confusion, what was wrong with his look. She sighed heavily and said that he was very much in love. The Archduke said that his look was like that because he truly loved her. He said she was dear to his family, and when she died, he didn't eat or sleep for a week. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that she found it hard to believe that there had ever been such a time. She said that, in any case, if he treated her like a rabbit in front of his uncle, then there would be no suspicion. Cedric looked at her and said that he even shared a bed with a rabbit. She smiled. Violet asked if he could even joke. She said that it was very good. The young lady looked at her husband and said that since they were spouses, they should address each other by name, as it would be natural. The Archduke looked at her and said that she should address him by his first name. She was surprised and asked if she could do that. He looked at her and said that in any case, everything was fine and she should call him by his name. The young lady looked at her husband with embarrassment and agreed. He looked at her and said that he would like to talk about the prototype potion. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it worked. Cedric said the prototype would arrive tomorrow, so they could give it a try. The young lady was surprised, but at the same time very happy. She smiled and said that she had always wanted to change her hair color. She sighed heavily and said that blondes were too common in this region. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really going to try everything on herself. Violet looked at him in surprise and asked what was wrong with that. Cedric said that it was still a prototype, and it was better to leave it to those who could even eat spoiled food and not make a fuss. He looked at her and said that, in any case, they needed to meet with the Count first, since they couldn't keep him waiting since it would ruin the impression. The Count in turn looked angrily at the young man and said that they were late. Cedric looked at the Count closely and said politely that he must have had a hard time on the long journey to them. The young lady was shocked as she understood that he had the title of Archduke, but neither of them cared. Cedric said that they should have invited him first, but he was thinking too narrowly. The Earl asked if he really wanted to imply that he had shown up uninvited. Cedric said that if he missed his daughter, he could come any time. Cedric looked at the Count and with a sly smile said that he was the father-in-law the Count took this blow. The Count understood that he could not lose. Like this he wanted to strike. The Count said that his daughter was destined to become a princess. He said that since the Archduke had brought such a person, he should treat her properly. The Count asked what kind of clothes she was wearing. The Count said that his baby does not even pay attention if this thing is not luxurious accessories, and jewelry must be magnificent. The Count said that everything should be at the highest level, as if she were in the capital. The young lady was shocked by what the Count was saying, as she remembered her last visit to the Archduke, when Vivian forced her to wear a dress. Cedric said he hadn't thought about it, and would contact the clothing store right away. The Count said he should also contact the jewelry store. Cedric said that everything was correct, and he could learn a lot from him because his father-in-law knew his daughter better than anyone. Cedric asked his father-in-law to continue to help and teach him. The Earl smiled and told him that he was very good despite his appearance. Sometime later, the young lady received many luxurious and beautiful outfits. Cedric looked at her and with a smile told her to choose. The young lady was shocked because from the first day she arrived at the Archduke's house, he immediately filled the wardrobe with everything necessary and even called a tailor. But she knew her stepfather was watching, and she needed to choose and buy a few outfits. Violet opened the catalog and asked to see some outfits. She asked if they could prepare a winter coat in advance that would be warm and stylish, as the Duke's lands were quite cold in winter. Of course, she wanted to see dresses that were cool in the summer and just as luxurious, but she asked what about cozy and calm designs for the fall. She was shocked because she knew it was very difficult to choose, but she still wondered how much she would have to spend on all the outfits. She understood that her entire salary would go just on outfits. Cedric looked at the shop owner and said that, to start with, they would order everything they had just looked at. The young lady was shocked. She didn't understand who had decided that. Cedric looked at the salesman and said that they would be coming from the jewelry store soon, so they could not spend much time choosing clothes. The saleswoman smiled and said that she would certainly prepare their order. Nisha smiled, looking at the lady, and said that, as expected, everything suits her. The Count said with a smile on his face that the young lady has a talent for being stylish. Violet moved closer to her husband and called him. She looked at him puzzled and said that she simply couldn't afford all this. She looked at her husband and said that she had just received her first month's salary. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about, as he did not understand. He came closer to her and quietly whispered in her ear that naturally this was his gift to her. The young lady froze in place from embarrassment. Cedric looked at her and asked what kind of limited man would use his wife's excellent salary for such purposes. He said that of course it would be paid for from the budget of the Archduchy. The young lady looked at him and said that if they were an ordinary couple, it would be so. But he did not answer her. A moment later, looking at his wife, he said that clothes affected the prestige of the family, so she could consider them a business expense. Violet looked at her husband and agreed with a smile. She understood that everything was true and that the clothes and jewelry belonged to the Archduchess, and when the time came to leave, she would leave everything behind. But nevertheless, wearing such beautiful clothes and jewelry was a pleasure for her for some time. So they bought everything at once, from clothes to jewelry, and the shopping was over. The Count, in turn, was very pleased. Violet knew that Vivian also always bought fashionable things from season to season, but not on such a scale. She thought that soon rumors would spread throughout the empire that the Archduke spent a fortune on his wife. Sometime later, the day finally came for the demonstration of Violet's developed potion. A total of 3 types of potions were made. As Cedric said, there were those fools who could be fed, even the spoiled ones. The young lady wondered if the workforce was too highly skilled. The young lady looked at the knights and told them to take 1 potion each. They were delighted, but she still wondered if it was possible to use the Black Wolf Knights in this way. The Archduke looked at the knights and told them to drink the potion. Violet was shocked because he didn't explain anything to them and just made them drink the potion. The Archduke looked at them and said that they had to drink every last drop. She was shocked as they obediently drank it all in one gulp. She wondered if this was knightly loyalty. A moment later, they started laughing at each other as the knight's hair turned into a fiery carrot, while the other knight's hair turned green. The third knight was in shock as he did not understand where his hellish curls had gone. The knights were in shock. They did not understand where their curls were and shouted that their hands were no longer stuck in their hair. The Archduke's assistant said that the effectiveness had been proven, and it remained to be seen whether there would be any side effects. The Archduke looked at her and told her to record everything in detail. The young lady looked at the knights in surprise and asked where the potion for softness and shine was. Cedric looked at his wife and said that it was here. Violet looked at her husband in surprise. He looked at her and asked with a smile how she was. We looked at him in surprise since he had thick hair. Cedric smiled and told her to look at the texture since he had washed his hair with that potion. The young lady was surprised, looked at him, and asked if he himself had not said before that it was dangerous to use potions on himself. He smiled and said that in the worst case he would go bald. But that was not a problem. She looked at him in surprise and said with a smile that of course it was a big problem, but still, even without hair, he would be handsome. Cedric said that, nevertheless, everything was fine. She touched his hair and said with a smile that it was in good condition, and also asked if he felt any side effects. Cedric smiled and said there were no side effects. The young lady smiled and said it seemed to have gone well. A moment later, she heard some noise and looked at the knights with her husband. They looked at the knights with bewilderment, who were rejoicing. The green-haired man and the knight asked with a smile if they could leave already. The Archduke told the manager to observe the reaction and condition for a week and take notes, and he told the knights to cooperate with him. A week later, it was concluded that there would be no problems with selling the greens. The young lady smiled and said that they could now move on to production and sales. The assistant hesitated and, looking at the lady, muttered something timidly. She looked at him in surprise and asked what had happened. The young man said that purchasing materials was not a problem, but there were difficulties with turnover. The Duke was furious. He asked who dared to open a potion business. The Duke shouted that if everyone started trading with the Archduke, it would be the end for them. The young lady was puzzled, as she was trying hard to avoid the Duke. The young man said that it seemed the Duke was trying to monopolize the production of potions itself. The Duke wanted to punish the thief since leaking recipes to families is not normal. He wanted to punish strangers without a conscience. The young lady was puzzled, since she kept her morals and left everything to them. She did not understand how this happened. She said with a grin that then all that remained was to act as they expected. She said that they should throw away all moral principles. She said that they would create the same potions that they sell, but superior in effectiveness. The young man agreed with her. She understood that the manager no longer doubted her words, since she had managed to create the potion. He was filled with trust in her. The manager looked at her and with a smile asked what she was selling the cocoa beans for. The manager said that, as she had said, they had raised the price and were selling, and even what they had bought from the Count had been sold. The young lady looked at the assistant and said that Count Bilot had soon understood the situation, but she was a little concerned by the lack of protests. The assistant said that pulp processing is also continuing, and mass production can begin as soon as the epidemic completely subsides. She smiled and said that everything is going smoothly. She understood that now she had to meet and make allies of the priests, but only in such a way that Duke Vassel did not know the Silver Deer is the largest organization of priests in the empire. When she played, she used them to control the situation in the ring. She knew they had the information she needed, but first Violet wanted to throw them bait. The young lady smiled when she saw her friend, as they had not seen each other for a long time. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really come to her during the day. Violet asked with a smile what had happened. She smiled and said that he always comes only late and at night, and leaves at dawn. She smiled and hugged him, saying that he was a lively puppy, and she asked him if he had really come here today to take a nap. A moment later, she fell onto the bed with him. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really washed himself, since his fur looked better than usual today. She wondered who made him wash himself. She smiled and said that today he looked cleaner and neater than usual. Playfully, she lifted him up. The young lady smiled and said that, as she thought he was a male. Sid got scared and ran away. The young lady froze in bewilderment. She did not understand why his friend ran away. The young lady sat on the bed in bewilderment. She did not understand why he suddenly ran away. She wondered if he was really that surprised. She understood that she needed to catch up with him and bring him back. Some time later, she looked closely at the estate grounds as she was looking for him. She thought she would find him quickly, but she didn't even see his tail. She thought that it must have been unwise to follow the wolf from the beginning, but she looked around in surprise, because she didn't know what kind of place this was. She was puzzled, as she had not even seen a single ant. She had already noticed earlier that compared to the size of the estate, there were not many people here. Cedric did not like it when there were many people, so he reduced the number of servants to a minimum. And yet it seemed to her very much that this quantity was not enough. Nisha said with a smile that they were enough. And after such an answer, the Archduchess could not object. She learned that she could take a short walk, and sooner or later find herself in familiar places. Violet understood that since this had happened, she could explore the Archduke's estate to the fullest. Some time later, a young lady entered the room. She was surprised as it was a family history museum. Entering further into the room, she saw a beautiful portrait. The young lady was surprised and wondered if this man was the father of the current Archduke. She was surprised at how strong genes were, because she understood that from the very beginning of the family, everyone had black hair and purple eyes. After she came here, she had never seen anyone with such black hair. She looked at the portrait with a smile and wondered if this is what her husband would look like when he grew old. She knew he would be a very handsome middle-aged man. A moment later, a window popped up in front of her, informing her that there was an item nearby that could be collected. The young lady was surprised, but still agreed. A few minutes later, she received a map. She was surprised because the art looked like a map of the estate, but she was surprised to wonder what the note on the map was. She was informed that this was a mysterious map of the treasures that were hidden in the Archduke's museum. She saw the note, namely, she was notified that she could find a very valuable thing, much more valuable than the greatest luxury. She was very surprised, but also puzzled, since except for the map, she did not even know where she was now. She was very sad, as she had no idea where she was going. But luckily, she managed to meet a maid passing by. The maid looked at her puzzled mistress, as the mistress was worried about something. She looked at the table in surprise and noticed a map of the estate. Nisha asked the Archduchess if this map was really their estate. She smiled and said that she understood everything, and she took it from the museum. Violet looked at the maid and asked if she could see it. Nisha hesitated. The young lady looked closely at the maid and asked what place was marked on the map. Nisha began to examine the map, and a few minutes later said that it was the Eastern Garden. Nisha said that this was the Archduke's personal space, and the Archduke's personal space was not in the Western Garden. The young lady was surprised when she heard about Cedric's personal space. She was going to go there, but she still felt uncomfortable. She understood that it would be very strange when she was digging in the ground. She could tell him that, of course, she looked strange and suspicious, but he should not pay attention to it in her mind. The Archduke would immediately agree and understand her. The lady understood that she could not say such a thing to him under any circumstances, and for some time she thought about what she should do about it. She knew there was only one way left. She knew it wasn't necessary to go there during the day. Violet said it wasn't that urgent, and put the map in the drawer. The maid looked at her mistress and called her. A moment later, the maid said that she had received a letter. The young lady was surprised. Nisha said that it was a response from the Cardinals of the Silver Deer. The young lady was surprised because she had sent them a letter only a couple of days ago, and they responded so quickly it seemed like they were in a hurry to answer. Violet called the maid and said that she wanted to write a reply right away, but she ran out of stationery. She asked her if she could bring her everything. Now Nisha smiled and told the lady that she would do everything. A few minutes later, the young Duchess was left alone in the room. Violet looked intently at the window. She said that she knew that someone was hiding at the window, and also politely asked if that person could show himself to her now, since she wanted to talk to him. A moment later, the Archduchess saw the young lady. Mia is a secret agent of the Etzel family. Mia looked closely at the Archduchess and asked in surprise if the Archduke had really told her about her. Violet smiled and said that no one told her anything. Violet knew that her husband had assigned someone to her, and that's why she used her observation skill. Violet said with a smile that she would pretend that she didn't know anything, but in return she had to fulfill one request. Mia, in turn, said that she only accepts orders from the Archduke. Violet looked at her and said that that's why she said it was a request, and Mia could tell Cedric about it if necessary. Mia was surprised. Violet, in turn, knew that she would tell the Archduke anyway, so she understood that it was better to give permission herself and make a good impression on her. The young lady said that she needed to find one person. Mia asked the Archduchess if she really needed to kidnap the person. Violet was surprised. She said that she just needed to bring him to the estate. Violet told Mia that once she met him, and he had no choice but to follow her, the Archduchess said that she would immediately write down for her the information about the person to find. Mia looked at the Archduchess in surprise and asked if she had really sent Nisha away on purpose, telling her to go and move the chancery for her. The Archduchess said that was true, and if she hadn't shown up, it would have been much more difficult. Violet gave her the sheet of information and asked if she could fulfill her request. Mia said that she would do everything and would definitely report back. The young lady was puzzled that her husband did not come. Violet knew that Mia had reported to him and left, and he hadn't even come to ask what the matter was. She wondered if it was because he trusted her or was confident that he could handle any consequences. Nisha smiled and said that she was finished. The young lady thanked the maid for doing her hair so beautifully. Nisha smiled and said that the mansion was busy right now, so she was a little excited too. It had been a long time since they had a mistress, so everyone was happy. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if the people who were wary of her weren't more wary. Nisha smiled and said the lady that she came from distant lands, so everyone is just a little afraid, because the Etzel estate is a very closed place, and although the Archduke brought her here by force, she lovingly takes care of these lands. The young lady in turn knew that it was not because of love, but because of the salary. Violet looked at Nisha and said with a smile that they could end it here. The young lady asked her if she really spent so much effort on this makeup. She asked if today was some special day. Nisha said that today was not quite an ordinary day, but that the Archduke would be absent for a few days. Violet looked at the maid in surprise and asked why he would suddenly be absent since she had not heard anything about it. Nisha, looking at the lady, said that the Archduke regularly has business on the full moon of each month. This is a very important event, so it is installed in a separate house. Violet was very surprised, as she knew that her husband rarely left the mansion. Ordinary nobles enjoyed gambling, horse riding, and socializing, but Cedric was always locked in his mansion, constantly busy with paperwork. She wondered if such a person really went out somewhere regularly every month. Nisha said that the Archduke would come to say goodbye before leaving, so she thought it would be nice for Violet to appear before him in new clothes. Violet timidly said with a smile that she thought he wouldn't come. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise and asked why she thought so. The young lady knew that her husband didn't care about her at all, so no matter what she did, he wouldn't react in any way. This time she entrusted Mia with a strange task, but the Archduke only responded with silence, because from the very beginning, she was simply the subject of a deal. She understood that there was no point in saying goodbye and announcing the future absence of a person like her for several days. Nisha looked at the lady and said that the Archduke was simply embarrassed. Looking at the mistress, the maid said that the master had lost his parents and had lived alone in this large estate all this time. She said that he had lived alone for so long that all his visits anywhere and receptions with anyone here had become awkward. Nisha said with a mischievous smile that for this reason, when he brought her here, they were very surprised. The maid smiled and told her mistress that someday she would be able to understand him. The young lady understood that by the time this happened, she would already be leaving this estate. In any case, it was a contract for 3 years. The young lady understood that while her husband was not in the estate, she would need to go to that garden and check everything. A moment later, there was a knock on the door. She turned around and was surprised to see the Archduke. The Archduke, in turn, looked at his wife with surprise and embarrassment. A moment later, he timidly asked if he had disturbed them. Violet looked at her husband and said that he had not disturbed them at all, and everything was fine. She was a little surprised, since he still came to warn her about his departure. She looked at him and said that she heard that he was leaving for a private house today. Violet, in turn, looked at her husband and asked what business he had going to a private house every month. The Archduke looked closely at his wife and said with a smile that this was something she did not need to worry about. The young lady was very angry with him for answering her so coldly, but she still said that she understood him. She was furious because the fact that he was drawing the line so openly made her thirst to win even stronger. She repeated his words to herself sarcastically. It wasn't something she needed to worry about. She knew that was what he said, pretending to be polite, but really just pushing her away. She wondered if he thought she couldn't break through that wall. She was very upset because she thought they had become a little closer lately, but she still knew she had to push those thoughts away. She sighed heavily and told herself that she would not worry about him and that he should leave quickly. She looked at him in surprise, as she didn't understand why his face looked so puzzled. Violet was puzzled as a belated shame visited her. She did not give him a chance to show his maturity. She knew she had to go and get her treasure first, so she took the map and the shovel and said with a mischievous smile that she had to go now. The estate, in turn, was divided into eastern and western parts. The eastern part was the space of the Archduchess, and the western part was the personal space of the Archduke. In addition to the south of the building where Cedric was located, there was an office of the managers and a training center for knights. She realized that the garden was in the center of the east side, so if she went in the right direction, she would definitely not get lost. She knew that she just needed to choose the right direction. The young lady was shocked because she had topographic cretinism. Violet knew that Mia was also absent at the moment at her request, and it was night, which meant no one would be passing by. The young lady was shocked and wondering what to do. A moment later, she heard some noise. A few minutes later, she was in shock as a wolf attacked her, and she suddenly screamed. The young lady was confused, but a moment later, she recognized her friend. She hugged him with surprise and joy and asked why he scared her so much. She looked at him embarrassedly and asked if he was really apologizing for scaring her. Violet smiled and hugged the wolf. She said with a smile that he was very good. Hugging him, she said that even a beast will open its heart and come to you if you look into its eyes for a long time. At that moment, a double distorted memory popped into her head of her husband smilingly saying that she didn't need to know where he was going, and she was furious and didn't understand who was even saying such nasty things. The young lady looked at the wolf and asked with a smile if he was worried about her. She thanked him for his concern. Sid, in turn, only barked, confirming her words. The young lady looked at the wolf and asked if he knew how to get to the eastern garden. She said that she would like to go there. The wolf looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he came closer to her and tugged at her sleeve. Violet looked at her friend in surprise and asked if he really wanted her to follow him. A moment later, the young lady smiled and told her friend to lead the way, and she happily followed her friend. After some time, they came to the eastern garden, following the wolf. They walked along a road unfamiliar to her. She looked at her husband's office in surprise. The Archduchess was very happy as she had reached her destination without any problems. She looked around in surprise and wondered why the place was so abandoned. She said that she thought that the managers paid attention to even the smallest details. A moment later, a window appeared in front of her, and she smiled and said that she had found what she was looking for, but still wondered what was hidden there. In the notification window, she saw very interesting information. She was notified that she had found an unknown treasure, the estimated value of which is 500 million gold, and it is a very fragile item. The young lady was shocked, wondering how much could be done with such a huge amount of money. She immediately began digging the ground in search of treasure. After 30 minutes, she became very tired and fell to the ground as she could not dig anymore. Sid came closer to her and began to lick his hands. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he was trying to calm her down. She said that he was a very good friend. Violet sighed heavily and said that she had already made up her mind. The wolf looked at her in surprise. The young lady looked at her friend and said that she would tell her husband everything honestly. Violet looked at the wolf and said that actually that would be the right thing to do. She said that she found a treasure map in the museum and that this is where the treasure is located. She understood that she would not be able to dig it up herself. But of course, this was not the only reason why she decided to tell him everything honestly. She said that since the treasure was found on the Archduke's lands, it would be right to split it in half. Violet said that was what she had originally planned to do. She wondered what if he said it was the original Etzel family piece, so he asked for more. She sighed heavily and said there was nothing she could do about it, and she would have to share it with him. She sighed heavily and said she would work hard and earn money. She said that even when she played all the games in the hospital, she never had any luck in the lottery. She knew that time and effort suited her much better. Violet knew that she just needed to quietly go back. The next morning, the young lady was in despair, as her back and muscles were still aching. She knew it was all because she had dug the ground yesterday. The young lady looked at the bed and saw that the wolf had already left. He took her to her room last night, and they ended up sleeping in the same bed. She thought that the wolf was like a fickle wind. A moment later, she saw a note on the bed and was very surprised. The note said that Mia had brought Keel, and that he was currently waiting for her in the living room. The young lady understood that Mia had brought good bait to catch the silver deer. Sometime later, the young lady entered the living room and saw the man she had been looking for so long. Keel looked at her in surprise. Violet looked because, as expected, he is as handsome as in the game. In the game, he was sold into slavery precisely because of his appearance. He persistently tried to escape to find his family, once he managed to hide for a while, but eventually he was caught again. While his will was suppressed, his character only became more ferocious. Because of this, he never stayed with anyone. He was constantly bought and sold, moving around the slave market, so she was easily able to buy him at the market. The young lady looked at Keel and said with a smile that she was very pleased to meet him. She said that she brought him here. She didn't have time to finish, as the young man interrupted her and said that he didn't care. Mia was shocked. She grabbed the young man and said that he was very rude. The Archduchess looked at her and said that everything was fine since he did not touch her. He looked at her and said with a smirk that she had paid too high a price for his release from slavery. He said angrily that she was one of those terrible people who think they can safely buy others with money. The Archduchess looked at him with a fixed gaze and said that she agreed with him. Keel looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Violet smiled and said that it would be much better not to buy it, but just to pull it out of there. But it was difficult. She said that whoever gave her the money to buy it did not want unnecessary fuss. But in turn, she knew that he would take payment from the silver deer for pulling it out. He looked at her with fury and surprise and asked what she meant by that. The Archduchess said that the fact that the returning owner was a runaway slave would be quite a burden on the silver deer, so she had no choice but to buy it. Now, the silver deer leader is only a temporary replacement. The real family of silver deer leaders was destroyed in an attack long ago, but the body of the youngest son was never found. Therefore, the remaining members of the silver deer searched for their master for many years. But because Keel was so young when it all happened, he had no memories left, and as a result, the remaining members of the silver deer were forced to give up and stop searching, while the young master became a slave and wandered from one master to another. The young man looked at her with anger and asked if she was really asking him to believe this. The Archduchess looked at him intently and told him to judge for himself how else she could find out his name. He looked at her and said that his ring had his name engraved on it. Violet looked at him and said that she would just prove it to him. The young man asked in surprise why she was helping him. Keel asked with rage and despair what would happen if he turned out to be not the one she needed. He was in shock and could not understand how she found him at all. He asked her what she wanted from him, in general. The young man wondered what kind of game she was even playing. The young lady, in turn, realized that this was not a game in the game. She also came to him and saved him. But then, it was all so that the silver deer would support the second prince. Violet looked at him and said with a smile that if she was wrong, she would take responsibility. She said that she had to borrow the power of chance from the notes her mother left her. And she was just lucky. She said that she only wanted him to keep his trust in her. The young lady smiled and said that she had only saved him from the life of a slave. She smiled and said that he could trust her completely. Keel. He was shocked by such a statement and looked intently at the young Archduchess. She looked at him and said that he would help her, and she would help him save himself. The young man looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand how he could help her. He looked at her in surprise and said that her life already seemed quite comfortable. Violet thought for a moment and said that this was all he needed to know for now. Since she had her own circumstances, she said that she was not going to take advantage of him, so he did not need to worry. She looked at him and said with a smile that he, of course, in turn, was very handsome and attractive, but he was not her type. But for a moment she paused, wondering who was her type. But the only one who came to mind was her husband, who met all the criteria. After some time, the Archduchess arranged a meeting between Keel and representatives of the Silver Deer. The man and woman were in shock. They looked at their master with tears in their eyes. They said that he looked very much like his mother. They were sure that he was definitely their master. A moment later, they showed him the portrait. They said that it was the only copy left. Keel asked in a trembling voice if this was really his family. They cried and asked their master for forgiveness for finding him too late. Keel, in turn, looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he would not forget the trust shown in him. The young lady smiled and said that her trust was very valuable. The young man smiled an embarrassed smile and said that it would be cheaper than his life. The Archduchess looked intently at the young man and said that she needed something from him. Keel said with a smile that he was glad to hear this, since he now felt like a useful person. She smiled and said that later he would hear many more of her requests. Keel said that he would certainly look forward to this. The young lady was furious. She looked at the young man and asked why he didn't leave. Keel in turn lay on the sofa and quietly ate cookies. She looked at him and said that he had regained his name and met with the people of the Silver Deer. She said that now all that remained was to return home. He looked at her and said that she herself had asked for trust. The young lady looked at him in surprise and confusion, as she did not understand what trust had to do with it. He looked at her and said that they had left the person with whom he shared his faith. She asked in surprise, since when, and he said that since the moment he decided to trust her. She said angrily that it was 3 days ago. The young man looked at her intently and said that everything was correct. She asked why he spoke as if he had these beliefs from birth. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she didn't think he was so annoying. She knew that she had Ideal in the game. She entrusted him with saving Keel. The young lady wondered if he had behaved like that with Ideal too, but still she knew that with his character, he would not tolerate such a thing. Keel sighed heavily and said that when the people from the Silver Deer looked at him, he turned completely pale. He looked at the young lady and asked if she knew how burdensome it was. Violet looked at him and said that of course she knew he looked at her, and said with a smile that she seemed to have said something about saving his life. He told her to be responsible until the end. Keel looked at her and said that he would stay here for a while, just until they calmed down. He looked at her and said that she had said earlier that she wanted to entrust him with something. She knew that in the future she would create many more things and sell them, but she could not do it personally every time. She knew that besides the capital was the best place for a business center. She could not go there all the time, so every deal will be made through the head of the Silver Deer, who will appear out of nowhere, and it will look like a plan created by Keel, and fame will appear, and she just has to quietly move in the draw and make a profit. She knew that she hadn't started running a business seriously yet, so there was no need for him to be too active yet. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was just not her home, so it was a little awkward. He looked at her in surprise and said that she was an archduchess. The young lady agreed with this statement, but this house still belonged to her husband, and she was a person who could leave this house at any moment. Keel walked closer to her and asked if she was really that modest. He said that she didn't act like someone who had received such a high title. She said with a smile that it was because everyone had their own story. The young man smiled and asked what the story of their archduchess was. Violet looked at him in surprise and asked with a smile who gave her permission to call her our archduchess. Keel asked with a smile what he should call her. He looked at her shyly and called her name with a smile. She knew that people in this world were always surprised when she asked to call her by her name. Violet looked at the documents and said with a puzzled expression that he could call her whatever he wanted. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was seriously asking to be called by her name. The young lady was surprised. She asked what was wrong with that, since it was just a name. She looked at him and said that she was actually working, so he could stop distracting her. Keel. He didn't take his eyes off the young lady. He saw that she was indeed very strange. The young lady knew that the signing of the contract for the supply of potions to the Silver Deer Society went smoothly. She knew that since she was Keel's patron, society favored her. They didn't even care that it would lead to serious disagreements with the duchy. She knew that the Duke must be very upset and angry. The young lady, in turn, was very happy, since the processing of cocoa pulp was in full swing. The epidemic was completely under control, so labor was quickly found, and a moment later she tried the prototype. The young lady, in turn, enjoyed the taste. She said that she personally really liked the taste, but she didn't know if others would like it. Keel looked at her in surprise and asked what it was. Violet looked at the young man with surprise, as she had completely forgotten that he was nearby. She said that he just happened to be here. The young lady pushed the plate closer to him and asked if he would like to try the dried cocoa pulp. Keel looked at the treat in surprise. Violet looked at it and said that right now it's still a prototype in the development stage. She looked at him and asked if it tasted normal, but was in turn taken aback. Keel tasted the cocoa pulp straight from the Archduchess's hands, and a moment later he said it was very tasty. The young lady was furious. She looked at him and asked why he ate her piece. Since she had already bitten into it, she shouted at him and told him not to do such strange things. Keel smiled and asked her for forgiveness. He said that this is all he learned in his life. Violet was taken aback, as she didn't know what to say to him. A moment later, someone called her. Turning around, she saw her husband, who was looking at her in surprise. The young people looked closely at the Archduke. Violet was very glad to see her husband. Cedric in turn said with a smile that he had heard that they had a guest, and he politely asked if it was really him. Violet looked at her husband and apologized for inviting him without an invitation. Violet looked at Keel and told him to introduce himself. Keel looked at the Archduke and introduced himself, and he also said that he was a representative of the Silver Deer Society. The Archduke in turn looked at the young man with surprise. Violet smiled, looking at her husband, and said that the young man was in charge there. She said that he remained at the estate to discuss the sale of their lands. Violet looked at the young man and asked angrily why he was so uncooperative. Keel asked quietly in surprise what she didn't like again. The Archduke looked closely at the young people. He did not like at all that they were so close. Keel quietly asked her if this man was really her type. She asked in surprise how he knew this. The young man said that he judged by the way she spoke to him. A moment later, the Archduke called his wife. She looked at him with a smile. Cedric said that his father-in-law was looking for them. Cedric looked at his wife and said that this was a family conversation, so he would like to move to another place. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked if something had happened. Cedric said in turn that while this was unknown, they were slowly let into another room. Cedric looked at the young man and said that they needed to leave his presence. Keel looked after them intently. He understood that it was becoming even more interesting. The Count sighed heavily and said that it seemed he needed to return to the capital. The young lady looked at her stepfather intently. She wondered if it wasn't obvious. The Mountain sighed heavily and said that, to tell the truth, he didn't want to go there. Violet came closer to him and said softly, with a smile, that she hoped everything would be all right. She said that there must have been a lot of work accumulated. The Count sighed heavily and said that if it weren't for the problems with the capital, he would have stayed here longer. The young lady said sheepishly that due to his absence for 1 month, it was natural that problems could arise. The Count said that everything was already very annoying to him, and he was better went to the battlefield again. The young lady looked at the Count and told him to be careful, because if he was absent from the capital for a long time, His Majesty might doubt his loyalty. The Count looked at the young lady in surprise. She knew that spending this time on the Archduke's lands was not very good. Now that the Emperor had abdicated the throne in favor of the Crown Prince, he could take everything under his control. Yes, it might seem to him that the Archduke having the right to inherit the throne was thus increasing his influence. Recently, the Crown Prince is in a more precarious position than the second Ediel is an idiot who can't do anything without her advice. But he still has foresight and the remnants of power, which means it is unknown what his next move will be. The young lady understood that if she wanted to live without problems, she needed to pay more attention to this. The Count looked closely at his daughter. She understood that she wanted to lose, as if in a game. The Count looked at the young lady and said with a smile that His Majesty was not that kind of person. She said that there was no need to look for any excuses. That same evening, Isaac also left for the capital. And at the end, he said that he would like to meet them when the social season opens. Finally, the couple wished him a good journey. The young lady still didn't think he would go, but she understood that there was nothing to worry about now. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and said that the sun had just risen, and also asked what had happened. Nisha looked at her mistress in surprise and asked if they had really slept together again today. The Archduchess said that there were attacks, and since her stepfather left, the wolf began to come to her often. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked what happened. Nisha, puzzled, said that there was a big problem. Nisha said that Duke Vassel had filed a lawsuit against her, so a man came from the capital. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and bewilderment. Violet was shaking with fear. She didn't know what to do now the wolf came closer to her and calmed her down. A moment later, she hugged her friend tightly. Violet looked at the maid and asked her to explain how this happened. The Duke in turn accused her of stealing secret recipes from the family and opening a business based on them. The newly developed and launched potions took a stable place in the market, thanks to the help of the Silver Deer Society, and quickly began to displace the Duke's potions from the market. The most popular product is Sham Sham, which acts as a shampoo. Potions that change hair color are also in great demand. They are often bought to change the mood or before parties, and they also deliberately started selling the same potions as the Duke in order to provoke him. Thanks to the brand's image as a fashion-forward brand, these potions sold very well, much better than the Duke's, thanks to which the family's income and her personal earnings grew day by day. The young lady said that it was even better this way. She said that she would have to enter into negotiations with the Duke and then move on. She looked at the maid and asked how the trial was going. She said that His Majesty himself was leading the process. It was the Emperor's duty to guard the secrets in the family of aristocrats. Violet said that she would need to go to the capital. The maid asked if everything would be okay. The lady said that she had not stolen anything. She said that if she could not prove her innocence, the family would have problems. But still, the business would have to be re-established. The maid looked at her mistress puzzled and called her. Violet looked at the maid and told her with a smile, not to worry, the Emperor Duke Vassel. Vivian, those annoying people were blaming her again. She just wanted to live peacefully in the estate. The young lady knew that she would make them regret dragging her into trouble. The man looked at the servant with anger and asked when the Archduchess would arrive. The servant looked at him and respectfully apologized for the delay. The servant said that she had fallen asleep late yesterday, so she had not heard when the maid woke her up. The man was furious and asked him what he was talking about as he had arrived there already at dawn. A moment later, a young lady entered the room and asked with a smile if she had received a subpoena. She politely asked for forgiveness, with a smile, for the fact that the man had waited for her for a long time. The man was taken aback, looking at the young Archduchess. A moment later, he said that he would now read the summons from His Majesty, the Emperor, to the Archduchess. He said that at the end of this month, at a court in the capital, she must answer to the charges brought against her, and if she does not appear, then all the charges will be admitted, and all the money earned in this way must be returned. He looked at her and said that, in addition, the sale of greens is prohibited until the end of the trial. The young lady was shocked by such a statement. The man said with a smirk on his face that the trial would take place in 5 days. He looked at her and said that he would also report today's events to His Majesty. The maid glanced sideways at her mistress and asked if she was okay. The young lady sighed heavily and said that sometimes anger is a strategy, especially when dealing with influential people like the Emperor. Cedric entered the room and asked his wife if she was okay. Cedric looked at his wife and said that she did not have to answer the charges and that he would answer for her. She looked at him and said that everything was fine and that she was not guilty, so she would go to court herself. He looked at her in surprise and asked if their potions had anything to do with the Duke's family. The young lady realized that people must have thought that she had developed a product based on the Duke's family's recipe. From the outside, it seemed to everyone that the Duke loved his stepdaughter very much. She said that their potions were created only thanks to her skills and knowledge. They have nothing in common with the Duke's potions, since she did not even know their recipes. The young lady wondered if they would believe her if she said so. The Archduke, in turn, looked at his wife in surprise. The young lady understood that proving her innocence would not be easy. She realized that instead of believing him, he just didn't really care. She looked at him and said that it was very important to win in court, and first they needed to sit down and talk about everything. Cedric looked at her and said that comparing 2 recipes was the surest way to prove innocence. She sighed heavily and said that no one would want to reveal the recipe. Violet looked at him and said that it was because once the secret of the recipe was revealed, the end for the business was obvious. The Archduke said that His Majesty treasured the Crown Prince. Cedric said that he had supported the Duke by arranging a marriage with the Crown Prince, and he had intervened and destroyed that agreement. The Archduke said that, although this was called a trial, in the end, the decision would depend only on His Majesty. The young lady looked at her husband and said with a smile that she was not going to lose. The day before the trial, the young lady was at the Duke's estate. Violet looked sideways at her knights and told them to keep their cool. Talon said angrily that they had already been waiting for 5 hours. Violet smiled and said that it was nothing, and she thought the Duke would appear very soon. She looked at her knights, and with a smile told them to smile to win. The young men looked at their mistress in surprise. Violet looked at the Duke with a smile and said that he had finally come. She said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The Duke, in turn, looked at her angrily. He sat down angrily opposite her. The young lady was surprised. She wondered if he had already stopped pretending to be friendly. The Duke looked at her and said that, in any case, they could meet tomorrow in court. He angrily asked why she came to him today. Violet looked at the Duke and said with a smile that she asked him for a meeting today because she wanted to reach an agreement. The Duke looked at her with fury and said that she was very impudent and behaved accordingly. He said that she first broke the wedding agreement and ran away, and then stole the family secrets he asked in his old age, how she dared to ask for an agreement. He said angrily that even though she was his stepdaughter, and he tried his best, he shouted that he even found her a good husband, and she stabbed him in the back. She smiled and said that if this was really such a good marriage, he should have offered it to his own daughter. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady said that she was talking about the Crown Prince. She said that if this was such a lucrative marriage proposal, then it was worth making Vivian a princess. The Duke was taken aback and froze in shock. The Duke said that it didn't matter to him what she said now, since he would receive his punishment for theft in court. She asked if he really wanted this. He said that her archduchy would now be of no use at all. The knights could barely contain their anger. He looked at her and said that the Archduke even the unique right of merit used, and in the end received nothing. She looked at him, and with a smile said that it seemed he did not fully understand something. The young lady smiled and said that she was not offering the agreement for herself. Now Violet said that this was her last favor to the Duke who raised her. He looked at her with fury and asked what kind of nonsense she was talking. She asked him if he was sure he would be okay if it went to court. She said that he didn't know what she would do when she was backed into a corner. She looked at the Duke and said that, for example, she could reveal to everyone the secret recipes that she had stolen, and after that, anyone in the Empire would be able to start their own potion-making business. She looked at him and said with a smirk that it meant that if she went down, so would he. Violet said that drowning alone would be too frustrating. The Duke looked at her with fury and shouted. He asked if she really thought that if she did this, she would get away with it. Violet looked at the Duke and asked with a smirk if he didn't know. Violet moved closer to the Duke and said that she didn't have many options left. The young lady said with a gentle smile that if the Duke did not press charges after making an agreement with her, she asked with a smile if he now understood the current situation. The young lady thought for a moment and said that in addition to potions, they also sell cocoa very well. She looked at him and with a sly grin asked what to do if he had no other income besides potions. The Duke in turn was shaking with anger. The young lady knew that of course it was a good bluff on her part. She knew that the cocoa bean business was unsustainable because it depended on the environment. But now she knew that the Duke was in no condition to think about it. The Duke looked at her with fury and shouted her name. He was angry. She came closer to him and with a soft smile said that she really was Violet Hale. The same Violet he had always looked down on and used to his advantage. She asked with a smile how long he thought this would go on. Violet looked him straight in the eyes and asked what he intended to do now. The Archduchess asked if they would make an agreement or go all the way. Zen clapped while standing. Talia nudged her friend and told him to be quiet. Nisha ran up to the lady in a hurry and called her. The maid was shocked. She looked at her mistress and asked how she could leave for the capital, since tomorrow was the day to return here. The young lady looked at the maid and said with a victorious smile that she had already figured it out. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady said with a smile that she would think about it in the evening, and that they would already receive a letter with the decision. Nisha asked the lady in surprise what she was talking about, and the knights in turn beamed with happiness. That night, the Duke retracted the accusation, claiming it was just his mistake, and the charge was dropped quickly to avoid tarnishing the Duke's honor and his suspicions of his stepdaughter, and the Emperor's envoy was met with hostility by Violet. The young lady knew that the Emperor's anger would definitely be directed at the Duke. The Archduke looked at his wife and said that he was sure that everything would turn out well, but did not think that it would be exactly like this. The young lady smiled and said that she had used his trust in her, and threatened a little. Cedric said the Duke told the others it was a settlement. Violet looked at her husband and said that the Duke wanted to look good in the eyes of others. She looked at Cedric and asked if Mia had told him everything she said that they could start packing. The Archduke looked closely at his wife and asked how she had noticed Mia. The young lady hesitated for a moment, not knowing what to answer. She understood that in order to explain everything clearly to him, she would have to reveal too much information. She smiled and said she just felt her presence. He looked at her incredulously. She said she thought he might have assigned someone to her, and there were a limited number of places to hide. The Archduke looked at his wife and said that he would like to give her a gift. The young lady was surprised and looked at the documents. She was shocked because now she was holding the Duke's real secret recipe. The Archduke looked at his wife and said with a smile that he had prepared these documents just in case, although they were useless now. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had stolen the recipe. Cedric smiled a satisfied smile and said that that was the case. He said that he thought that it would not be so offensive if she actually did what she was suspected of. She looked at him and said with a smile that it was very unexpected, and unexpected that he had such a devilish side. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was really that unexpected. Violet smiled and said that she thought he was more thorough and honest. He looked at her in surprise and said that she spoke as if he were a very boring person. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it really sounded like that. She thought for a moment, because she wanted to tell me this in everyone. She wanted to tell me that he was very sincere, not boring. And this was the side of him that she really liked. She looked at him in surprise and asked how he managed to steal such important documents since they were well guarded. He smiled but did not answer. The young lady smiled and said that it seemed like it wasn't the most elegant way. She knew that even the most honest person could have some devilish methods in his arsenal. She thought for a moment, as she knew she couldn't have pulled it off on her own. He looked at her in surprise as her expression changed dramatically. The young lady thanked him. He said there was no need for that, as it was part of his job. The Archduke took his wife's hand and said with a smile that his family never forgets about payment, so she can always turn to him. The young lady looked at her husband with embarrassment. Cedric kissed her hand tenderly and told her not to try to do anything alone. The second prince looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if the Archduchess had really done that. The Duke said furiously that she had actually done it, looking him straight in the eyes. He was shocked and wondered if she had really been so enchanted by the Archduke. The Duke said that he thought she had gone completely mad. The Duke said that although the problem with the potion was absurd, he tried to meet her under this pretext and convince her to return. But in turn, he could not have imagined that everything would turn out this way. The Duke looked at the prince and asked what they should do now, since it was his proposal. The prince looked at the Duke and said with a smile that he would perform. The Duke looked at the prince in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. The prince looked at the Duke and said that it was difficult for him to act now. Because of the emperor's reprimand, he said that, besides, he himself was curious. The prince said that he was very curious, whether the Archduke had really charmed the young lady or whether there was some other reason. After the trial ended, the potion business flourished even more, most likely a recognition of their uniqueness. They very beautifully turned failure into success. The young lady knew that the production of cocoa beans and herbs was on the rise, and it was time for her to start thinking about a new business. Violet knew that the more money she had, the more comfortable her life would be. But this time, she didn't just want to create some product, but to organize an excavation. It reminded her of the hunt for the Archduke's treasure. She understood that although she had not managed to dig up the treasure one day, she would still get it. The young lady suddenly remembered the treasure and the amount of money. The young lady sighed heavily, for she knew that not all of it was hers, but she still knew that however it was, the estate still had much of it in its original state. The young lady knew that she had to send out a search party first to select areas with natural resources, and if she used her research skills, she could get interesting results. She thought she could find a diamond mine. She knew that first she needed to assemble a search party. If she wanted to hire a geologist, it would be better to contact the Central Academy. Compared to the Imperial Academy for aristocrats, the Central Academy had more advanced practical training, but both institutions were equally prestigious, and she knew she needed to present her business plan and get recommendations from talented professionals. The young lady knew that all she had to do was give the letter to the maid after all her work, and after she finished, she shouted very loudly. The knights ran into her office in a hurry and asked what had happened. Violet looked at them and said with a smile that she had stood up very quickly, and her lower back had started to hurt. The knights in turn looked at the lady with puzzlement, but said nothing to her. A moment later, Zen said it was all due to lack of exercise. She felt sad even thinking about it, but she couldn't even imagine that they would immediately assign her to training. The young lady knew that the real owner of the body was an aristocrat, which meant she must have experience in horse riding. She knew that they shared the same skills, so she too would be able to ride a horse in any case. She was all in anticipation for her horse riding, which was constantly in the hospital, was an impossible dream. The young lady saw that the day was very sunny. She thought that she could create a sunscreen and it would sell very well. Zen saw the lady and called her with a smile. He said that it was the first time they saw her in a riding suit, and it suited her very well. The young lady thanked him with a smile. Zen looked at the lady and introduced the baby to her with a smile. He said that his breed was famous for its gentleness, and the owner himself chose and bought him. Violet was surprised that Cedric did something like that. Zen smiled as he looked at the horse and said that no one in the estate knew more about horses than the Archduke. Violet was amazed by the horse's beauty. Violet noticed a black horse in the distance. She looked at it in surprise and asked if this was the Archduke's horse. She said that they were the same, as if they were one. The young lady said that they were so perfect for each other that she couldn't even laugh at them. Zen looked at the lady and laughed. He asked if she wanted to try the ride. Some time later, the young lady was happily riding a horse. She smiled as she looked at the knights and said that she was having a lot of fun. Zen and Talon were delighted and happy for their mistress. Zen told Talon that they were in big trouble. Talon looked at him and asked who knew that their mistress could ride a horse so well. Zen said that their plan had completely failed. Talon said that, as expected from the Archduke's chosen one, she was not so simple. Talon looked at her friend and asked what they should do now, since everyone in the estate was following their plan. And the name of the plan was an exciting romantic date on a horse. Please mount the horse. The lady is bad at riding. The Archduke accidentally appears in front of the worried lady and kindly teaches her to ride. And then it's time for romance. Of course, the Archduke's men did not want to interfere in other people's love affairs, but they came to a rather logical conclusion. If everything continued in the same spirit, the lady would run away. They knew that their mistress was so beautiful that even a dead man would rise from the dead and propose to her. The people were very happy because after so much time, they finally had a mistress, and one who was so beautiful, both externally and internally, they knew that they could not let her go under any circumstances. Besides, everyone saw that recently some suspicious handsome guy has been making mistakes near the lady, and in the end they even had to create a romance control group. Zen looked at her and asked, "How about hunting instead of horseback riding?" Talon quietly told her friend that looking at the lady and her movements, it seemed that she could handle a weapon well. The Archduke looked at the knight and asked if anyone was riding a horse. Zen greeted the gentleman with a smile. Cedric looked at the knight in surprise and said that he had asked him to teach him a new riding technique, but had not even bothered to prepare everything. Zen sighed heavily, and looking at the gentleman, said that he fell in love with an overly perfect girl. Cedric looked at the knight and asked what he was talking about. Zen said that their mistress also rides a horse. Okay, Cedric said dryly that he understood everything. Zen looked at the gentleman and asked if that was all he wanted to say. He said that even if the romantic lesson didn't work out, he should at least praise her. The Archduke looked at the knight in surprise and asked what he was even talking about. Cedric said that besides, with such skills, she didn't need praise because she herself knew that she was doing well. Talon looked at the gentleman and said that it was not the matter. She looked at him and asked with a smile if he had not praised her at all. Cedric said that Violet did not need his praise. The knights were shocked by this statement from their master. The young lady looked away in surprise as she saw the Archduke and wondered when he had arrived. She saw that he was chatting pleasantly with the knights. Violet did not take her eyes off him. She wondered what his expression would be like when he saw that she was handling the horse so skillfully. A moment later, she called out to her husband with a smile on her face, but suddenly her horse tripped on a stone. The Archduke was very frightened and called his wife. She was in shock because she realized that she was going to die like this. But a moment later, she was already in her husband's arms. He looked at her with fear and asked if she was okay. She looked at him and said with a smile that she thought she had a fever, but she also thanked him and said that she was fine. Cedric looked at her with fear and asked if she was hurt anywhere. He asked if she was dizzy. Violet looked at her husband and said that she was fine and that nothing hurt. Talon was surprised that the Archduke got to his mistress so quickly. She wondered if he was really human. Zen smiled and said that at least they had succeeded with the romantic plan. Talon looked at him in surprise, asking if he really called this mess a success. Zen said that everything looked good, and that would do. Violet said she was pretty good at riding her son's horse, so she decided to show off. Cedric looked at her and said that the problem wasn't her skills. Cedric said that it was all because the land was not prepared properly, and it was the manager's fault. He said that the person in charge needed to be severely reprimanded. Cedric glanced sideways at his wife and told her to wait a second. The young lady looked at him in surprise. A moment later, he kicked the stone and it flew away, or in shock, since the stone did not even move when the horse kicked it. She wondered how strong he was. Cedric looked at his wife and slowly approached her. She was surprised and did not understand why he quietly decided to approach her. A moment later, he approached the horse and asked if she was very scared. He said he was very glad she wasn't hurt. The young lady was shocked because she thought he was coming towards her. She looked at him and said with a smile that he seemed to be very good with animals. The Archduke smiled and said that he had a talent for this. Violet looked at her husband and asked, "What about the wolves?" Cedric looked at her in surprise as he did not understand what she was talking about. She looked at him and said that his family history says that Duke Etzel has wolf blood in his veins. She said that, logically, he should get along well with wolves too. She knew there were myths about the origin of bears, or being born from eggs. He looked at her and said it was just a legend. The young lady said with a smile that in any case he knew better, since he had grown up side by side with a wolf since childhood. Cedric looked at her and said that perhaps that was true. The young lady looked at her husband and said that the best way to make friends with an animal is through food. And so Zen said, she looked at him and said that for this reason, she wanted to give something to Sid, but she did not know what wolves eat. The Archduke looked at her in surprise, as he was very puzzled. She looked at him and said that you can't give him everything he said that wasn't entirely true, but he thought water would be enough. She looked at him and said that it was too little and thought about giving him some fresh meat. Cedric shouted with lightning speed that this should not be done. Violet looked at him and asked what she could give him. Then he hesitated and said that she could give him regular boiled chicken bread. Fruit would also do. She looked at him in surprise and said that this was food. He said that it was. That same evening, the young lady prepared a treat for her wolf, and while she waited for him, she read the letters. Looking through the letters, she noticed that there was nothing urgent in them. Violet said that a selection of new clients would be left for the manager to review. Looking through the letters, she saw a letter from the Duke. She knew that she didn't even need to look at it. A moment later, she saw a letter from Uncle Isaac. She knew that her uncle was surprisingly very talkative and unexpectedly well-informed about the capital's rumors. He wrote that the Duke was completely destroyed by that incident with the denunciation, and he does not even attend meetings of aristocrats and behaves like a recluse. Vivian, in turn, also sits at home since she is no longer welcome in social circles. He wrote that for this reason, people should live honestly and correctly. The young lady was delighted and did not understand how much energy was in one letter from her uncle. The young lady sighed heavily as she understood that the capital was truly merciless. A moment later, she saw an unfamiliar letter and looked at it in surprise as she did not know who it was from. She was very surprised because she received a letter from the second prince. The young lady was very surprised and wondered why the second prince had sent her an invitation to a social event. She wondered if he really didn't know Violet at all, but she still threw the letter in the trash can because she knew that the prince was simply stupid and also had a complete lack of what is called thinking. A moment later, she heard a noise and looking back saw her friend. The young lady looked at her friend, and with a smile, handed him the treat. She said that he could eat it. She looked at him in surprise as he kept his gaze fixed on her. She wondered if bread was not suitable for wolves. She sighed heavily as she realized that her husband had deceived her. A moment later, he bit into the bread and began to eat. She smiled and said that it looked like he could eat it. Violet looked at him in surprise and said with a smile that she didn't know that wolves ate bread. She smiled and said that he could eat more fruit and be sure to drink water. Sid in turn stuffed himself with food. After the meal, he went to bed. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. Violet looked at the wolf and said that he had become much more impudent lately. She looked at him with a smile, as she knew that at first he was distant, but it seemed that he gradually began to trust her. The young lady in turn was very happy about this. She looked at him and said with a smile that they could sleep together. A moment later, she took off her robe and looked at him in surprise. She asked what happened. He sniffed her and turned away. The young lady was perplexed. She asked him again what happened. The wolf came closer to her and pulled the blanket up for her. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted her to cover herself because he was a man. She pounced on him with a smile and said that he was very cute. A moment later, she kissed him. The young lady looked at the wolf in surprise, as she did not understand his reaction. She smiled and said shyly that she would not do anything bad, just touch the tummy a little. She looked at him and asked what kind of relationship they had. A moment later, she burst out laughing as she was having a lot of fun. Sometime later, she was lying in an embrace with the wolf. She sighed heavily and told him that it was the first time she had slept with someone like this next to her, since up until that moment she had always been alone. She said that in fact, she could sometimes sleep peacefully, although she had problems with sleep even when she arrived at the estate. But since he started coming to her, her sleep became deeper. She smiled and said that it could all be because he was warm. The young lady kissed him and wished him sweet dreams. The young lady was shocked because the prince bombarded her with letters he wanted to meet her and was very persistent. The young lady was furious. She screamed that he was very annoying and wondered how many songs he sent her. She described that she was very busy and had a lot to do. Prince Yu in turn wrote that he would come himself and prepare everything himself. She was furious since this was their first meeting, and it was tactless on his part. She sighed heavily as she remembered that this was the reason why it was difficult to make him emperor. Of course she knew that there was a reason why the prince became like this for the emperor. There is a lot of morality and honor. An illegitimate child from a dancer was the biggest vice. The child grew up like a wild dog left without supervision, but he became quite popular because he grew up handsome and looked like his mother. Recently, the emperor greeted him with a smile and said that he was his son. The close attention from the emperor completely destroyed him. He said that if he became the heir to the empire, he would be able to receive the love that his father gave to his brother. She retreated into the fight for the throne out of curiosity and the desire to be loved, and on top of that, his opponent, the crown prince, who wins in almost everything. She learned that in the current situation, the emperor is the worst here. But the dubious voice that arose at that moment became the starting point. The young lady put all thoughts aside, as she did not want to get involved in this anymore. She refused, as the struggle for power was very tiring. The maid looked at the mistress and said that she had received an invitation from the imperial palace. The mistress looked at her and said that if it was from the prince, then she could just throw it away. Nisha said that another letter had arrived here, namely an invitation to a memorial service. Before the main storyline in the game, Contender for the Crown, began, backstories for the main characters were created. She knew that she had to get rid of the old characters, so that they no longer carried weight. And the best way to do this is war. The main villain was the Black Plague, a warlock who could control corpses. Count Hill and knights from all over the empire took part in the war. In those battles, Lady Adeline's first husband, Violet's biological father, died. That long wave ended more than 10 years ago, and the dark times came to an end. The memorial service was a big event to honor the heroes who died in the Dark Age. Violet sighed heavily and said that of course she should attend. The maid looked at her and asked if her father was a war hero. The young lady said that everything was correct. She knew that, for the real heroine, it was very important, but she had no reason to worry. But still, she knew that the second prince would be there too, and the meeting could not be avoided. She knew that her husband had never attended a memorial service, and there were rumors that he had never attended any events held in the capital. Everyone in the capital was whispering about the Archduke. They said that he was feeble-minded and even looked disgusting. She knew that it took at least a week for a non-capital aristocrat to travel to a capital event, but her husband instead locked himself away in a separate estate on personal business. She knew that these were very important matters that only a few of his closest aides knew about. But in any case, it was quite difficult for him to attend the event in the capital. She sighed heavily and said that she would have to go alone since her husband would not be present. She knew that if she went alone, she would be condemned in any case. The maid looked at the mistress and said that this time he would go with her. She said that the Archduke would soon finish his schedule. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if it was true. Violet sighed heavily and said that he didn't have to be so zealous. Nisha was shocked. She understood that the lady should be more greedy, but still she was a little anxious. But at the same time, she was very glad that her master would go with his mistress. The young lady said that, as she thought it would not be easy, so she wanted to go personally and tell him that he did not have to go with her. The maid was shocked. She shouted for the mistress to settle down. The young lady thought for a moment. She said that she had already been here a couple of times, so she knew the way herself, passing by the garden. She remembered that her treasure was hidden there. She thought that she should still go and see how her treasure was doing. Some time later, she burst into her husband's office screaming, and the Archduke looked at her in surprise. The young lady was taken aback when she saw that he was not alone. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she should come back later. He looked at her and said that everything was fine, since they were already finished. His assistant was very surprised and said that they were not finished yet. The Archduke looked at his wife and asked if she had come here for the memorial service. The assistant looked at his master and said that he would leave them. The man walked past the Archduchess and gnashed his teeth angrily. Violet watched him go, as she hadn't seen such open hostility in a long time, and Cedric called out to his wife in surprise. She looked at him and said that he didn't have to go there if it was hard for him. Despite the strange rumors, there were enough reasons not to go there. He looked at her and said that of course there were reasons. But it wasn't what she thought. She looked at him in surprise. He said with a smile on his face that, for example, one reason to protect something, he said, is that the weak Archduke cannot attract the attention of His Majesty's. Cedric said his father ran the downtown area with great confidence. His Majesty was pleased with him and always kept him close to him. The young lady knew what the end result was. She looked at him and said that was why he had deliberately ignored the rumors. He smiled and said that His Majesty was a man who was very wary of powerful, control-obsessed people, and his father was not the kind of man who could obey anyone. She looked at him in surprise and asked if his ancestor's death had not been an accident. Cedric sighed and said that no one knows. He said that answering that question could be considered treason. The young lady thought for a moment about what her husband's story really was. Now she understood the true reason why he hid away at the beginning of the game and only existed in the estate, and then tried to overthrow the imperial family at the end of the game. She looked at him and said that he didn't need to say that, since she was a stranger to him and would someday leave the estate, looked at her, and said that, nevertheless, she didn't look like a person who would tell everyone about such things left and right. The young lady looked at her husband and asked with a smile if he thought she would fall for his beautiful words. Of course she was going to talk about it, or she would have found herself in the middle of a war for succession to the throne. She looked at her husband and said that of course he had enough opportunities to shut her mouth. If he wanted, he did not answer her words. A moment later, he said with a smile that she needn't worry about it, at least as long as she didn't leave him. Nothing dangerous would happen. Looking at him, she knew that one day it would happen. Cedric looked at his wife and said that in any case, it was unlikely that a man blinded by love enough to steal his bride would send his wife alone to her father's memorial service. He said that this also proved that the Archduke was not vain if they interfered with the prince's marriage. The young lady looked at her husband and asked if everything would definitely be fine on the full moon. He said with a sly smile that everything would be fine, so he was ready to go with hers. The Archduke looked at his wife and said that he thought she was looking for something that was buried in his garden. She was shocked by his words, as she did not expect him to say something like that. A moment later, She looked at him and told the service that, as she thought it was he, and the Archduke in turn only smiled. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked how he knew that she had found it. She was shocked because even if he had seen traces of the river in the estate where the treasure was, how would he have known that it was she? She knew that there was no one there except her. He looked at her and with a smile said that he could not help but know about what was happening in his estate. The Archduke looked at her and said that he would give her that thing. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise. He said that he didn't need it. She wanted to object to him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was really such an expensive thing. Cedric, despite his wife said that it really didn't look like a particularly luxurious thing. He said that even if this thing was very expensive, he did not need it, and he would very much like to repay her, since she had done enough for him. The Archduke said that with her arrival here, he began to sleep better. He smiled and said that before at night, he had so many thoughts that he couldn't sleep. The young lady looked closely at her husband and saw that his complexion had improved. She understood that this explained everything since the estate was very huge. She compared it with her former self, since even in a small hospital room, she was very lonely and scared. She guessed that he was very lonely after he became an orphan at an early age. She learned that there are times when just having someone around is a kind of comfort. Violet knew that thanks to her friend Volg, she also began to sleep well in a house unfamiliar to her. The young lady looked at her husband and said that it was still too much for her. She knew that it was a very huge amount. She looked at her husband and said that first, they needed to open it and look at the contents. He looked at her and asked if she could accept this without any burdensome feelings. A moment later, the young lady saw a simple and cheap ring in front of her, and that was the reason he said he would just give it away. She was shocked as the program showed that the treasure was very expensive. The unknown ring, which looks flawless with a simple design, may be made of silver, but still the estimated cost was very high. In the notes she saw only question marks. She used the analysis skill, but it seems to appear on its own when she lacks basic knowledge. But still, the young lady wondered what it was. A moment later, she saw a pop-up window that informed her that you are her Loopsbaum mind, the skill of careful analysis of the legendary awakened. A moment later, she saw another window informing her that she lacked the information to unlock all the secret features. But after some time, the analysis was completed, and new information appeared. She saw that the ring had enormous power and was in fact made of adamant. Adamant is a special material unique to this world. Although it is very hard, it can change shape depending on the owner. It also contains magical power, so it was used to make weapons and armor. The young lady was truly shocked. She wondered if such a valuable material could have been used to make a simple ring, and the Archduke looked at his wife in surprise. A moment later, Violet tried to put the ring on her finger. She noticed with surprise that the ring had changed size. The Archduke looked at her with the same surprise and asked if the ring really changed size. He said that it looked like an adamant. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was a simple and cheap silver ring. He said that it was not visually recognizable, so it would not attract attention, which made it even more valuable. He looked at her and said that he was very surprised. The young lady looked at him as he was very close and was embarrassed. She said in a trembling voice that it was indeed very surprising. She sighed heavily and said that first she needed to take off this ring, but all her attempts were in vain. She looked at the ring in surprise and asked why she didn't take it off. She looked at her husband and asked if the material really had such a property. Cedric said that this could not be, since in turn knights wore armor all their lives. He said that he would certainly find a way to remove this ring. He asked if it was really that uncomfortable for her. He looked at his wife and said that perhaps it was some kind of magical power. Violet looked at him puzzled and said that she was fine. Cedric said that if she was really uncomfortable, it would be better to tell her right now about it. The young lady smiled and said that everything was fine with her because the ring was found on his estate territory. He said that just in case, caution would not hurt. The young lady thought for a moment as she remembered that she was able to reveal the information under the question marks. Thanks to the skill, she knew that through the touch of observation and investigation, additional information could be found out. But she still had a lot of question marks left. The young lady looked at her husband and saw information about him, but she still saw a lot of question marks that hid a lot of information about her husband. She realized that she had already observed enough, and since they lived in the same house, they had to collide on various matters. The young lady looked at her husband and said that she had one request for him. Cedric looked at her intently and said that he was listening to her carefully. She looked at him and said that it might seem a little strange to him, but she had no bad intentions. He looked at her and with a soft smile said that after she said that, on the contrary, it became even scarier. The young lady smiled and asked if she could touch it. The Archduke froze in bewilderment. He looked at his wife in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Violet looked at him and said that she would like to touch his body. Violet, for her part, knew that she had no ulterior motives. Cedric, in turn, opened his arms to her and asked where exactly she wanted to touch. She knew that she might need to touch his chest, but still she didn't know if it was right. The young lady walked up to her husband and touched his chest. He looked at her with a puzzled expression. She was delighted because his chest was very hard, but at the same time pleasant to the touch. She wondered how a person could be like that. She saw the notification window and noticed that she only knew her husband 17%. She was a little puzzled, as the information she received through the analysis was the same as she knew. She felt a little sad because she understood that he was a secretive person who didn't tell much about himself, but not that much. Although she understood that everything was true, since he did not even say a word about the death of the previous duke, especially since they had an arranged marriage, so he could be understood. She understood that to find out more, it was not enough to just touch him, a more thorough analysis was needed. He looked at her and asked if she would continue to touch him. The young lady looked at him in surprise. He said that if her hands went a little lower, it would become a little difficult. The young lady was taken aback and moved away from him in shock. She looked at him with embarrassment and said that she didn't do it on purpose, because she was lost in thought, and she herself, without noticing, touched him. She didn't know what she was saying. She understood that the fact that her hands were inadvertently moving downwards and also looked strange. He looked at her and asked if she was really okay. Cedric looked at his wife with confusion and said that it looks like there is some kind of bad energy in the ring. She looked at him and said that it was not. So she understood that she just had bad hands. The young lady knew she needed to change the subject quickly, and a moment later, looking at her husband, she said she wanted to talk about the wolf. Cedric looked at her in surprise and asked what was wrong with the wolf. She was very glad that he was interested in this topic. Violet looked at Cedric and asked if Sid hadn't been spayed. In turn, the Archduke looked at his wife with fear and bewilderment. The young lady looked at his frightened face. She was a little shocked and wondered if she had really said something strange. She said that she had read in a book that if an animal lives with a person, it is better to sterilize it. The Archduke said that he understood her. She said that it can be painful every time the heat comes, and in severe cases, troubles can arise during the search for a partner to dispute. Violet said that of course this forcibly takes away the instinct to reproduce, but the wolf has definitely already become domesticated. He looked at her and said that even if this is not done, the wolf will definitely not cause problems. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he thinks so. A moment later, she asked in surprise if the wolf had already been castrated. Cedric in turn smiled, but said nothing. Violet looked at her husband. She understood that he did not want to continue this conversation. She thought that he was still embarrassed to talk in such a way about someone who was attached to him. She thought that on his part, it was a careful concern. The young lady still thought that her husband was a very good man. She looked at her husband and said that it was not a problem at all. On the contrary, it did not hurt, and nothing needed to be done, and it was even good that he had already been castrated. Cedric sighed heavily and agreed with her. The maid looked at the young gentleman and saw a heavy atmosphere. She was surprised and did not understand what had happened. Zen joyfully went into the mistress's office and called her. The young lady looked at the knight in surprise. She did not understand what was going on at all. He smiled and said that the memorial service had finally arrived. The memorial service became the largest, with the unification of the empire, after the end of the era of dark catastrophe. At first, it was important to honor the heroes who sacrificed themselves for the peace of the empire. Over time, the essence changed. The events turned into hunting competitions between nobles. They hunted animals to put them on the altar, because the reward goes to the family that offers the most victims. The young lady was not particularly interested in this kind of competition, but it would be polite to come there and show off, so she also needed to be present at such an event. Zen looked at the lady and said with a smile that he thought her archery skills would be as good as her riding skills. The Archduchess looked at the knight with a smile and asked if he really wanted to go to the memorial service that much. He said with complete confidence that of course he wanted to go there. He said that initially the Black Wolves had an absolute superiority in the hunting competition, but after the captain stopped visiting the capital, his glory was forgotten. The knight said that without them, the Golden Lion and Silver Hawk had become completely arrogant. Talon looked at the lady and with a smile told her not to pay attention to him, since he simply liked all kinds of competitions. Zen looked at Talon and asked if she was okay with being behind the others. She looked at him and said that she was perfectly okay with it, because the Black Wolf didn't even have to compete with them. Talon said that initially the competition was held between people who were at the same level of strength. She said that initially they were not rivals. The young lady looked at the knight and said that this was his obvious defeat. Talon looked at the lady and asked if she was already used to attending memorial services. The lady said puzzled that it was. She knew that the real Violet had experience, but for her this would be the first time, and naturally she had never held a weapon in her hands. The young lady looked at her and said with a smile that she hadn't shot for quite some time, so her hands had already forgotten everything. Talon looked at the lady and said with a smile that everything was fine, and she just needed to practice. Men use swords or bows, and women use muskets. Strong weapons are still not practical, and knights using shields can easily reflect flying bullets. For this reason, guns are used as play tools for ladies who only enjoy the atmosphere of hunting. Talon looked at the lady and told her to use this particular device, said that it would be good if a master installed it, but unfortunately, they did not have time. She knew that every aristocrat had his own weapon, but the lady did not take anything with her from her native estate. A moment later, the young lady took aim to shoot, and unexpectedly, she felt a familiar feeling. She was in shock, as her body remembered everything. Violet and her knights were shocked as she hit the target. The young lady was excited because it was her first time shooting, so she was very nervous, but everything seemed to go great. The knights were shocked as their mistress was a genius at shooting. Zen looked at the lady and said with a smile that he knew she would succeed. He said that he bet that no other lady could compete with her. Violet looked at him and said with a smile that after all, everyone had worked hard to learn this. Talon smiled and said that she agreed with him, since there was no better shooter than their mistress. Violet smiled and asked if this was true. She said that in that case, she could relax. Zen looked at the mistress and asked why she only heard what Talon said. The young lady listened for a moment, as she could hear the other knights training. Violet asked Talon if the knights were training today. She said that they had it every day. Violet asked her if they weren't training. Talon said that it was an order from the door, and they had to accompany the lady. Zen said that the Archduke had chosen those who didn't have to go to training, so everything was fine. The lady looked at them and asked if it really meant that they looked down on everyone among the knights. Zen sighed heavily and said that he himself knew what kind of image he had. Violet looked at him and said that considering how he usually acts so far, her prejudice about him is justified. He puzzledly told her that she should see what he is like in a fight. Zen said that they can watch the training. Talon smiled and said that if the lady came, then everyone would definitely be happy. Violet looked at her and said with a smile that in that case, there was no need to hesitate and they should go straight away. The young lady looked into the distance in surprise and asked if it would be polite for them to come empty-handed. Talon said that everyone would be grateful simply for her to honor them with her presence, because aristocrats usually weren't interested in knights training. Violet knew that this was true, since normally a lady would not go to the training ground because it was dusty and smelled of sweat. Zen smiled and said that it would be a great joy if the lady they served was present at the training. Talon said that at this moment, Zen is indeed telling the truth. Zen smiled and said that before you get a star, you need to see the sky. But their captain became such a lazy ass because he was constantly at the estate, so everyone began to worry whether he would be able to find a lady for the rest of his life. Zen continued to praise the young lady. A moment later, the Archduke approached him and asked what he said about his butt. Zen was in shock, as he did not expect to see the captain. He was so scared that he even hiccuped. Zen looked at the Archduke and said that he almost lost such a talented man to a heart attack. Cedric looked at him in surprise and asked if a man who discusses his master's ass was really a talent. Zen looked at the captain with a puzzled look and asked if he had really heard everything Zen said, that he thought the captain was very lazy, but his hearing was very sharp. Cedric said that they could be heard from the training ground itself, and he simply could not have missed them. Cedric looked at the knight and told him to stop talking nonsense and quickly change his clothes and start training. Zen looked at the captain and said that this time he almost lost a very big talent due to a heart attack. Violet looked at Talon and asked if this always happened. Talon said that Zen was the jester of their night course. The young lady smiled and told her husband that they were very cheerful. The Archduke looked at the knights with puzzlement and said that he only cared about the weight of his master's ass. Cedric looked at Violet and said that he heard that she had been practicing archery. The young lady said that her skills were better than she expected, so she finished early and came here to look at the knights. She said that if she couldn't, then she would leave them immediately. The Archduke, in turn, looked at his wife with a smile and asked how this was possible. He said that if his wife could not watch the training of the Black Knights, then who could do it at all? The young lady was delighted with the knights' training, as she saw how diligently they trained. She was surprised that they did not train with wooden swords. Cedric said that no one here had picked up wooden swords since they were 6 or 7 years old. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it wasn't dangerous. He said that they couldn't be knights if they were afraid of the sword. A moment later, she saw her accompanying knights training. The young lady thought that Zen would use his skill, and Talon would use his sword skills, which focused on strength. The young lady was delighted, as it was the exact opposite of what she had imagined. Violet looked at her husband in surprise. She was interested to see her husband's swordsmanship. She thought his swordsmanship was exquisite and noble. She wondered if, contrary to her expectations, he was using dirty methods. A moment later, the Archduke hugged his wife and stepped away from the sword that was flying towards them. The young lady was in shock and very scared. She was shocked because she realized that a real sword almost flew at them. The knight flew up to them and asked for forgiveness. He said, puzzled, that because of the sweat the sword slipped out of his hands. He yelled at him all the time and asked how he could call himself a knight if he couldn't even hold a sword in his hands. He said that he in turn was punished for a week. The young lady was a little puzzled as she understood that her husband was not merciful to the mistakes of his subordinates. She was in shock, as she was so scared that even her legs weakened, but she still wondered why everyone looked like they were laughing. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise as he was very close. A moment later, she said that everything was fine and she could stand on her own. Cedric looked at her closely and said that her body was weak and he couldn't let her go. She was shocked because he was so close that her ears turned red. She said in a trembling voice that everything was fine. He looked at her and said that she was very scared, so she needed to finish the training. He said that he would immediately take her to the room. She was very surprised because he wanted to carry her to the room in his arms. Violet said that she could walk on her own 2 feet. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she was going to walk if she couldn't even stand. The Archduke looked at his wife and said that swords could be found everywhere, especially at hunting competitions. She, puzzled, said that she could also carry weapons with her. Cedric told his wife that it would be nice if she could protect herself if possible. He said that Zen and Talon would always be there for her, so she needed to stay close to them. She looked at her husband in surprise and asked if he was too worried. She said that there were a lot of eyes around, so even if someone decided to do something bad, it would not be easy to carry out. Cedric looked at her and said that if someone really wanted to do something, then nothing was impossible, since the previous Archduke died during the competition. She looked at him closely because she knew that he had always remembered this. She knew that although he held the title of Archduke, he was still young. The young lady moved closer to her husband and stroked his head. He looked at her in surprise. She was surprised because she felt a tingling in her heart, as if someone had captured it. On the day of departure to the capital for the memorial service, the servants were bustling about and collecting their master's things. Talon looked at the lady and said that she would go to the transfer gates by carriage, and from there she would instantly reach the capital. Talon said that the others would be riding horses, so she would be alone in the carriage. Keel looked at Violet and asked with a smile if she had really come after all. The young lady, in turn, was very surprised to see her friend. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing there. He smiled and said that, unfortunately, he couldn't ride a horse. The Silver Deer's headquarters is in the capital, so he also went with them to the teleportation gate. She knew that he was a slave, so he could not learn horse riding. The Archduchess looked at Talon and said that everything was fine, and they would just ride together in the carriage since he couldn't ride a horse, so it wouldn't be possible to kick him out. Talon agreed with the lady. Keel looked at her with a smile. A moment later, she saw her husband and his displeased face. Violet was puzzled by his expression. The young lady wondered if something had happened. The young man looked at her and said with a sly smile that it reminded him of playing with dolls. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He said that they seemed to have a good relationship, but at the same time it was quite ambiguous. If we talk about the relationship between a man and a woman, even though they were spouses. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he knew at all, that she could rudely discuss someone else's marriage. The young man looked at the Archduchess intently and said that he really had not been taught manners. She asked if he was really going to continue talking like that. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She said that he uses his sad past as a shield and says whatever he wants. Violet asked if he really likes it when someone sympathizes with him and forgives him for anything. The Archduchess looked at him and said that this was not cool at all. The young man froze in place, as he did not expect to hear something like that from her. He thought for a moment and said he didn't know that looking at her. He said no one told him how to live his life in a cool way, and he had no idea when he said it that it didn't look cool. He looked at her with a smile and asked if what he had just said wasn't cool either. Violet said that, since he didn't understand anything, it meant they could miss this moment. He looked at her with a smile and said that he seemed to understand very little of their conversation. Sometime later, they were informed that they had arrived at the transfer gate. Keel, getting out of the carriage, asked the young lady if she was close with the second prince. She looked at him with surprise and anger and asked what kind of nonsense he was talking about. He looked at her sideways and asked if it was true. He said that the second prince had long ago begun to appear frequently in the company of the Silver Deer, and he was also constantly interested in Violet. The young lady froze in place, not expecting to hear something like that at all. She wondered if her confrontation with the Duke had attracted the prince's attention. She also asked whether the Duke was now acting through the prince, since he could not do so directly. Keel said that he originally came there just as a business partner, but it didn't seem like he had good intentions, so he warned the young lady to be careful. She looked at him and smiled and thanked him for what he told her. He looked at her and said with a smile that they had a trusting relationship. Keel said that it was much better than playing with dolls. Violet looked at him in surprise. The boy looked at his friend intently and asked why she was looking at him like that. She smiled and said that she just suddenly thought that he had a cute face. The young man sighed heavily and said that, for a man, this was not a compliment at all. She smiled and said that he was still cool. She looked at him in surprise and asked what his reaction was. She asked if that wasn't what he wanted to hear. Keel sighed heavily and asked if she was saying that because he wanted to hear it. She smiled and said that no matter what anyone says, beauty is a weapon. She said that it plays a very important role in expanding her business. She smiled and said goodbye to him, and also said that when he returned, he should help her promote the sale of dried cocoa pulp. The Archduke looked at his wife and said that they needed to go. She looked at her husband and asked if she would feel dizzy this time too. He hugged her tenderly and said that everything would be fine. The young lady looked tenderly at her husband and said with a smile that she should get used to this as soon as possible. Keel sighed heavily. He realized that he had nothing to count on at all. Some time later, they arrived in a forest near the capital. Violet looked around the surroundings. She knew that the Duke would have certainly built more luxurious barracks near the imperial family. She wondered if he was pretending to be self-sufficient because of his recent disgrace. She knew that now was not the time for others to worry. She understood that she was the girl who almost became the crown prince's wife, and next to her was the man who took the bride away from the crown prince. She understood that everyone was looking at her too closely. She understood that before the end of the memorial service, many aristocrats would say a lot about them. She looked closely at her husband, wondering if he was okay. A moment later, the Archduke embraced his wife, and the young lady in turn was very surprised. Cedric looked at his wife and asked if she was already tired. She sighed heavily and said that she was soon tired, then tired, the servants greeted the masters. The Archduke looked at her and said there was nothing he could do. Everyone would gossip about them. They entered the tent, and he said she could rest there until the imperial family arrived. She was surprised, because it seemed to her as if an entire room from the estate had been transferred into one chamber. She knew it would most likely be in the afternoon, because the one who arrives last looks nobler. She thought that most likely the crown prince and second prince would come too. She wondered how it would feel in reality, but she still understood that she would be uncomfortable facing them, Obama. She sighed heavily as she decided that she would try to avoid them at the hunting competition. The emperor looked at everyone and said with a smile that he would like to thank everyone for having come such a long way. Everyone greeted His Majesty the Emperor and wished prosperity to His Majesty. The emperor said that the era of chaos and disaster was over, but I too should forget the heroes who sacrificed themselves for the sake of this world. He said that they had gathered today to honor their memory and to comfort their souls. He said that the animal that would be placed on the altar as a sacrifice was a very important part of the memorial service. While the emperor was speaking, everyone was staring at the archdukes. The young lady was shocked and did not understand why they were all staring at them so intently. It seemed to her as if they were about to burn a hole in her head. And both princes, whom she didn't want to see and tried to avoid, were looking straight at her. She wondered if they weren't interested in what their father was saying now. A moment later, the Archduke covered his wife with his body. She was a little surprised and did not understand why he was doing this. She looked at him closely, as she was very glad that he covered her, but still she wondered if it was done by accident or on purpose. The emperor looked at everyone present and said that from that moment on, the hunting competition was declared open and would last until noon tomorrow, and the family that brought in the most game would be generously rewarded. The young lady in turn was very puzzled. She did not understand why she felt so uneasy. The Archduke looked at his wife and said that it was time for them to leave. But suddenly, unexpectedly, for them the emperor called them with a smile. The emperor came closer to her and said with a smile that they looked good. The young couple greeted the emperor's teaching. The emperor looked closely at the ruffed duchess and said that she looked especially well, and he was very worried because he let her go like that. He said that he felt much calmer when he knew that she was doing well. The young lady was puzzled. She couldn't tell whether it was sarcasm or genuine concern. She looked at the emperor and thanked him for his concern that these were matters of the past, so he could remove this burden from his heart. She said that His Majesty R's blessing was spreading throughout the empire. So she was calm. The emperor looked at her and said that if she had any difficulties, she could come to him at any time, since she had almost become his daughter-in-law. The young lady was puzzled and did not know how to behave, as she realized that this was a clear provocation on the part of the emperor. The Archduke looked at the emperor and thanked him with a smile for his concern. He said that since his wife had such a strong patron, his heart was at peace. The emperor said that he was proud that the Archduke thought so too, and asked if he should expect large spoils from him. He said that he would do everything possible. The young lady knew that the previous Archduke had died because of the emperor, and now her husband was holding back his emotions for the sake of the future. She couldn't even imagine what he was feeling. He looked at his wife and said that they needed to go and start before it was too late. He looked at her and said that according to the rules, men should use swords and not guns. They should hunt in a separate place from the girls. He told her not to overdo it, and to stay close to people. She agreed with him. Zen looked at the Archduke and asked if it was time to begin. He looked at the couple in surprise and asked what had happened. He asked if they hadn't exchanged signs. He said with a smile that couples or lovers should diminish the signs before going hunting because it makes sense to return back safely. They looked at the knight in surprise and said that it was not so dangerous that they should pray for a safe return. The knight sighed heavily as he realized that they had one brain between the two of them. He said that it was all a matter of mood. She was a little surprised and puzzled as she understood that she had nothing at all to give to her husband. A moment later, she removed the ribbon from her hair and handed it to her husband with a smile. The young lady was taken aback as she thought the ribbon was an ominous color and wondered if she could use such a ribbon to wish for a blessing. She understood that this was all she could offer her husband, since her personal servant had given her this ribbon because the color symbolized the Archduke's family. The Archduke handed her the sacraments and said that he could give her nothing more. She looked at him in surprise and said that he should use them during his departure. Zen said with a smile that their commander did not need gloves. And a few minutes later, the Archduke saddled his horse and hurried off to hunt. A moment later, the maid approached the Archduchess. A few minutes later, the young lady called for the knights. She looked at the knight and said with a smile that she had prepared something and asked if he could distribute it to everyone else. He looked at the lady in surprise and asked what she had. She smiled and said that she had prepared sunscreen for them because if they were to stay in the sun for a long time, their skin could get burned. She had come up with the idea while she was riding a horse, and that was how the recipe for sunscreen was created. The production was quick because she was able to find all the necessary ingredients. At once the knight thought for a moment about what his mistress had said. A moment later, he said with a smile that they were not aristocratic girls and did not need such things. She smiled and said that it was not only girls who had to be careful with sunlight. I said that the cream not only prevented skin burns, but also protected against aging. She looked at them and asked if they really wanted to become wrinkled like a plum when young the knights were shocked as they did not want that at all. She smiled and said that if they use it, it will be good for her, and also asked them to leave their feedback after using it. And if they are positive, she will launch the product into production. She was very happy because the growth passed her product. The young lady looked at her accompanying knights and asked if they would like to go hunting now. She was surprised, as she did not see anyone near her. Talon said that bears might appear in the depths, so it would be better to hunt near the barracks, as there would be foxes and hares there. The young lady knew that everything was correct, and there were no animals visible near them at all. A moment later, she looked closely at her husband's glove. She was surprised since his hand was very large. She looked around and wondered if the situation around her was strange. Zen looked around and said that something was wrong. He said that the competition had already started, and they should have already released the animals here. But there were no animals visible anywhere near them. Talon looked at the lady and said that they should still go back, since she had a very bad feeling, because it was too quiet around them. The young lady became wary as usually when someone in the group said something like that. Something bad happened. A moment later, the young people heard a dirty roar. Zen looked at the lady and told her to step back. A moment later, they saw a terrible bear. The young lady became very wary as she thought real danger was approaching them. The young lady was shocked because she saw a monster that looked like a bear. She knew it was only a matter of time before it would run towards them. She knew that if it was a monster, and not an ordinary beast, it would be much stronger than a real bear. Violet asked if it was possible that he would just run past Talon, looked at the lady and said that this could not be, since someone was definitely controlling him. Violet said that then they had no options except to destroy him. She asked what she should do so that no one would get hurt. Talon said that they would deal with him. A moment later, the young lady saw a notification looking at the bear. Burus is a monster, whose ancestor is a bear due to its great strength and speed. It is considered a difficult monster to hunt. The manicore is in the center of the chest. The young lady understood that this information was visible only to her. She understood that now, knowing his weak spot, she had an advantage. She knew that she could use her gun. The young lady understood that as soon as she had a chance, she had to act immediately. The knights went into battle and shouted to the lady to hide behind them. While they were fighting him, she loaded her gun. She understood that her knights were greatly inferior to the monster, so she could not deliver the decisive blow. But a moment later, the young lady still aimed at the bear. She understood that the reload speed was low, so she only had one chance. Violet knew she had to pull the trigger. When the manicore was clearly visible, she knew she couldn't rush at all. A moment later, she saw the core clearly. The young lady fired at the monster. The knights looked at the lady in bewilderment and called her. They were shocked, as they did not expect such a thing from her. Violet looked at the monster, wondering if one shot hadn't been enough. But a moment later, she saw that she had managed to wound the monster, and the knights looked at the bear with surprise and bewilderment. Violet was confused. She couldn't tell if she had hit the target or not, as dust appeared, and she couldn't see anything. The knights shouted to their mistress to watch out as the bear was falling and almost hit her with its huge paw. The young lady hesitated and froze in surprise. The prince looked at his companions in surprise and asked what it was. They clearly heard a rumble and noise. The prince looked at them and said that they needed to go and check everything. A moment later, the prince clearly saw the Archduchess. The young men ran up to them and asked if they were okay. The young lady smiled and said that everything was fine. She knew that she had dodged it as best she could, but she still wondered if she had really succeeded. The knight looked at them and said that they were hunting nearby and heard a noise, so they ran to them. A moment later, they saw the beast and were dumbfounded with shock. They looked closely at the Archduke Nu and asked if she had caught Burris. The young lady said that her knights blocked his movements well, but she just stood there and fired. The prince said that her shooting skills were simply superb. The prince said that the beast was very big and could easily lose his temper. She smiled and said that even if she was scared, it only helped her to pull herself together and try harder. But a moment later, her arm began to hurt. She looked in surprise that it was bleeding. She realized that when the beast fell, it touched her with its claws. In fact, she was much happier than she seemed, but she still understood that she needed to quickly stop the bleeding. A moment later, tears rolled down her face. Now she realized that she was scared. His wild eyes and terrible fangs, it seemed to her that he would devour her at any moment. She understood that she was living in a game world with skills that had been her weapon all this time. But now it all became her reality. The young lady now consciously realized that she could die. She fell to the ground unconscious. Zen screamed and called for the mistress. The prince, with the lightning speed of a film saga, comes to her aid. The prince came closer to her and said that she must have been very scared. He said that first they needed to establish the bleeding. The prince bandaged her hand, and she cried out in pain. The prince looked at the knights and said that their mistress was unconscious, and it would be better to take her to the nearest room. Talon thanked the prince. But a moment later, looking at the prince, she said that he knew very well how uncertain the relationship between the Archduchess and him was. The prince apologized and said that he was also confused and did not think about it. He told them that they needed to bring one of the Archduke's people. A moment later, the Archduke burst into the tent. The Emperor looked at the Archduke with a smile. The Emperor said with a smile that this incident was their negligence, that the culprit needed to be found, and he would definitely punish him personally. He also said that the competition would be established. Cedric glared at the Emperor, but said nothing. The prince knew that the appearance of dangerous monsters in the royal hunting grounds was a clear sign of negligence on the part of the imperial organizers, but he also knew that the Archduke did not show such a vivid manifestation of fear. The Archduke had always been apathetic and had little interest in anything, so when the prince first heard the news of his engagement being broken, he was quite surprised. And it wasn't because his bride had been kidnapped, but because it had been the Archduke who had done it. The prince looked at the Archduke intently, for he thought that he had been mistaken about him after all. The prince in turn wondered if it was because of his hurt pride that he was so angry. The emperor said that the young lady had lost consciousness, but they would still take her to the palace, so he did not need to worry. Cedric looked at the emperor and said that he brought a doctor in case of emergency, so that they would not have to take her to the palace. The emperor and the prince were shocked by this statement. The emperor looked at the young man with anger and asked what unforeseen circumstances he was talking about. The emperor said that he should know that the death of the former archduke, who had been his best friend for him since ancient times, was also a tragedy. The archduke said that he always showed his qualities as an emperor at the decisive moment. The archduke looked at the emperor and said that their family and memorial service were not compatible. He said that he wanted to be close to his wife and protect her, so he asked the emperor to show leniency and forgive his rudeness. A moment later, the archduke left the emperor's tent. The prince was shocked, since the duke had left without permission, and had clearly not apologized sincerely. The emperor looked after the archduke and said that he had finally revealed his true nature. The crown prince looked at his father in surprise. The emperor said that the young man was very similar to his father, and he could not be content with his quiet life in the archduchy. The prince said that he did not seem so ambitious, however. The emperor looked at his son and said that was why he was so naive. The emperor looked at his son and said that he had everything to become a great emperor, but unfortunately, he believed everything he saw, so he had no choice but to put his entourage in order. The prince looked at his father and asked if he had any direct connection to this incident. The emperor told his son not to talk nonsense, as cheap methods only provoke the enemy, and he could see this for himself. The emperor said that this incident was the duke's doing. The emperor was a little puzzled and angry, because they made such a fuss over just one child. The emperor, in turn, hoped that at least this time he would figure things out completely. He knew that this girl was supposed to marry behind his son. The emperor could not give anything to the house of Etzel. He understood that if there was no choice and no way to get back what was his, then he had no choice but to destroy it so that no one else could take possession of it. For a moment, the emperor thought, as he knew that his second son was also interested in the young lady. The emperor was puzzled and did not understand what it was about this girl, that everything revolved around her. Cedric, in turn, was talking to his wife at full speed. The knight informed the archduke that the archduchess had been attacked by a monster. The archduke was furious as he thought she was mortally wounded. He knew that the full moon was approaching soon, and he thought that this was most likely why he could not calm down. The knights looked at their master with puzzlement. They knew that they were very guilty in their turn. He saw that they looked confused. He understood that they did everything they could on their part. However, he was still very angry with them. The archduke said that they were dismissed, and for some time someone else would accompany his wife. The knights obediently agreed with his verdict. A moment later, he entered the room and saw his wife. He called her, but saw that she did not answer. He was puzzled because he could see that she was still in pain, even though she was unconscious. A moment later, he was taken aback as his wife pounced on him. The young lady hugged the archduke she called for Sid. The knight looked at the gentleman and said that the lady was constantly vomiting, so she could not drink the medicine. The duke told him to give him the medicine. A moment later, he tried to give her medicine, but all attempts were in vain. He knew that when a Tegu is unconscious, the body rejects everything. He realized that he simply had no choice and needed to try another option. A moment later, the archduke nevertheless gave his wife the medicine. The servants were shocked and confused, but they were still glad that their master cared so much about his wife. The young lady woke up. She was puzzled and wondered how long she had been unconscious. She was a little alarmed, as her whole body felt heavy. A moment later, she saw her husband in front of her. She was surprised, as she did not understand how this happened. Nisha ran up to the lady with a smile and asked if she had already come to her senses. The young lady looked at the maid and asked how long she had been unconscious. Nisha told the mistress that she had been unconscious all day long, and she also asked if she was okay, and if something was bothering her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that her body was a little sore, but still bearable, and it seemed that they used good medicine. The maid, in turn, was a little embarrassed. Violet looked at her in surprise and asked what was with her expression. Nisha smiled and said that nothing at all and everything was fine. The maid said that the competition was over, and it seemed like they had won. The young lady looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true. She also asked if her husband had caught something big. Nisha said that it was not so, and it was the lady who caught Beerus. And with her help, they got ahead. The young lady was a little surprised. She said that, after all, he was not the prey in the competitions. Nisha looked at the lady and said that she had caught him after all, and rumors about it had already spread everywhere. And in this situation, even the victory of another family would look ridiculous. The young lady sighed heavily and said that, alas, to some extent she agreed with this. Moreover, the incident occurred due to the poor management of the imperial family, so at least as compensation, the emperor should give the victory to them. Nisha looked at the lady and said that she was very interested in what His Majesty would give to the winner this year. Vile looked at her and asked if she would really have to appear in person to receive the award. Nisha asked if she would be okay. The Archduchess said that everything would be fine. The young lady looked at her husband and asked what happened to him. Nisha said that he was tired, as he had been watching Violet all night and had not left her side for a single step. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if he had really been courting her all night. Nisha smiled and said that it was true, and that he had even given her medicine. A moment later, she said with a smile that when the full moon approaches, the master takes strong medicine, as it is a kind of safety. But still, she could not tell the lady everything, and she should ask her husband personally. Looking at her husband, she wondered if this had anything to do with the fact that he went to a separate estate every full moon. Violet looked closely at her sleeping husband, as he was very handsome, but she was still puzzled and wondered why he had so many secrets. Thanks to the captured animal, they were able to take first place by a huge margin based on the results of the prey weighing. The Duke, in turn, took second place far behind. The young lady was puzzled, but still very glad that the medicine worked and the pain was significantly reduced. She knew that after such a huge chaos, they still took first place. She knew what prize they would be given, but she still wondered if it was worth sharing. A moment later, the young lady approached Violet and said with a smirk that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Violet saw Vivian and the second prince in front of her. Violet greeted the Duchess and also said that she was very pleased to meet the prince. The young lady, in turn, put on a duty smile in front of with important people. Vivian looked at her and asked if she no longer called her sister like she used to. Violet looked at the Duchess and said that after her mother passed away, the Duke and her younger sister took great care of her, even though they had different blood. Vivian looked at her and said that he must have been very upset by the accusations. Violet looked at her and said that it was nothing like that, and she just thought that she and the Duke had a little misunderstanding, and the apology was enough. Vivian looked at her in surprise and asked why she then built a wall between them, since they used to get along very well with each other. It is true that the Duke's image was badly damaged by the accusations, but her image still remained good, because it was the Duke who did all the work, not his daughter. Violet understood that if she pushed her kind sister away in front of everyone, she would show herself to be mentally limited. She knew that this was exactly what her sister was trying to achieve. She wanted to humiliate her, since she was determined to restore her lost honor. The Archduchess looked at Vivian and smiled, thanking her for worrying about her. The Archduchess looked at her and said that she was now a member of the Etzel family, and could no longer pretend to be a member of her family, and therefore could no longer call her sister. If we talk about etiquette, then Vivian the Duke's daughter should be polite to her, because she was an Archduchess. She saw that the aristocrats were sending a cue, they had already paid close attention to this, and she did not even have to try anymore. A moment later, the prince came up to her and said with a smile that they had finally met. The young lady was shocked, but still smiled at him. She knew that he was just a leech. She looked at the prince in surprise as he unexpectedly took her hand and kissed it. She was furious and wondered what he was doing. The prince said with a smile that he had sent her several invitations to meet, but she had rejected them all, and this was very upsetting to him. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that she had been very busy with the affairs of the estate, so she had no time to meet. She was furious and did not understand why he even mentioned it. She knew that he needed the Duke now, so he pretended to be faithful to Vivian, but he himself was very popular in female circles. She did not want to meet him in the future. The young lady looked at the prince and said that the award ceremony was coming soon. She asked him why he was not helping His Majesty. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked what he was doing there. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that she understood everything, and also said that she was the winner. She smiled and said that it was time for her to go. Because of this cookie, she looked at the prince and said with a smile that he could continue spending time in the company of beautiful ladies. The prince, in turn, looked at the young ladies with anger and bewilderment. The emperor looked at everyone present and said that he, the winner of this hunting competition, would become the Archduchy Etzel, also a reward due to the Archduchess. Since she caught the most outstanding prey, he looked at her and told her to come to him. The young lady slowly walked towards the emperor. She in turn caught his gaze on her. They discussed her without stopping for a second. The young lady said that she looked so much like her mother, and at this rate even Vivian couldn't compete with her. The emperor looked at the young lady and said that because of his negligence, she was injured, and therefore, in addition to the reward, he also had to apologize. She said that it was enough for her to only receive the reward for the spoils, since she could not get an apology from him. The emperor smiled slyly and said that she was very modest, and that made him regret it even more. The prince looked at his father and told him to stop talking about it. The emperor in turn only laughed. The second prince knew that if he said this to the emperor, he would only be yelled at for his rudeness. The emperor looked at the young lady and asked if she had something she wanted as a reward. She smiled and said that she would be happy with anything the emperor would give her. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she would really be happy with anything. She smiled and said that of course she would. The emperor thought for a moment. The young lady did not understand that it would be wonderful if he immediately gave her a mountain of gold or silver. The emperor looked at her and said with a grin that he would give her the lands of Amar. Everyone was shocked by the emperor's statement. She looked at the emperor in surprise, as she did not expect him to give her land. The emperor looked at her closely and said with a grin that today she would become Archduchess and Countess of Amara. She knew that this was just a reward for the winner of the hunting competition. In addition, the emperor supports the crown prince and wants the power of the second prince and archduke to be weakened. She was puzzled and did not understand why he granted her lands and title. She knew that first, she had to refuse. She looked at the emperor and said that this was too great a reward for her. The young lady asked the emperor to take her back. The emperor said with a smirk that those lands were not as good as she thought. He said that this was his reward, and also homework. He said that he would give up understanding it correctly, since he had not met the young lady for a long time that he liked so much. She knew it was just an elegant trap under the guise of a reward. She knew that the land granted by the emperor himself could not be treated as is. If not managed properly, then one could become a criminal who had ruined the lands that the emperor himself had granted. She had previously heard that this reward and homework were from him. She understood that he would closely monitor her and the land. She understood that if she offended the emperor, the consequences would affect her husband. She understood that the emperor had set a trap even for her husband, but if they divorced, he would stop. She smiled and said that in that case, she would gratefully accept his gift. The emperor told her with a grin so that she would not disappoint him in the end. Everyone present was whispering as they were shocked that she had become the lord of the lands. In an instant, they were shocked because this had never happened before. They were asking how much His Majesty favored her. Some even wondered if he had still not given up on his intention to make the young lady the crown princess. She understood that she urgently needed to learn more about the new lands. The evening of the memorial ceremony arrived. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why she was shivering so much. Nisha looked at her in surprise and said with a smile that they had already cut up and prepared buris. The young lady looked at her in surprise and asked if such meat could really be eaten. Nisha said that, of course you can, and it is famous for its taste, but you won't find anything like it in the duchy. Nisha looked at the lady and said that they say that they have become hypocrites, but in their estate she can enjoy the best food and live as she wants. The knights praised the lady. They said that she had also received lands and become a countess. She understood that their reaction was quite natural, given that they did not understand the hidden message. The archduke came closer to her and said that it was probably all because of him. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what exactly. He said that when she got hurt, he got a little angry at the emperor, and most likely this made him wary, and he decided to set such a trap for them. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really that angry about her injury. She looked at him in surprise and said that he had been careful all this time. Cedric looked at her and said with a smile that that was exactly it. She froze in place as she did not expect to hear something like that. He looked at her and said that it was predictable because he was her guardian and responsible for her, and it was natural to be angry about her being hurt. She looked at him intently and thought about what he had told her. She knew that even her parents had never done anything like that for her. The priest looked at them and told them to be quiet as the funeral ceremony was about to begin. A moment later, the ceremony began, and the priest said a prayer. The young lady now understood what sacredness meant. Even if she was not the daughter of a war hero who was sleeping in eternal sleep somewhere, she knew that the real owner of the body would now be begging with all her heart for peace. The priest looked at the emperor and said that he could begin. She thought for a moment, because she was wondering where the soul was now, and the real owner of the body. She was wondering how she got into this world and into this body. She was puzzled because she knew nothing about it at all. After the official ceremony, there was a party. The young lady was very surprised. She noticed that everyone was drinking a lot, and the young lady understood that they were consoling themselves rather than remembering the souls of the departed. She saw that her husband had already been captured by his subordinates. Violet was surprised and wondered why Zen and Talon were nowhere to be seen. Nisha said that the Archduke had punished them with temporary suspension from service. The young lady was surprised because instead of harming them, he had punished them. Nisha, looking at the lady, said that she was injured and suffered, but for knights the result is much more important. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would need to talk about this with her husband later. A moment later, someone called her name, and she looked back. Violet saw Lilith in front of her. Marbelle, daughter of the Marquis of Marbelle, was the only person her age who did not belong to Vivian's retinue. Lilith looked at her and asked how she should address her. Lilith listed all the titles, Violet said, with a smile that she could address her, however she felt comfortable, since she herself was not yet used to everything. Lilith looked at the young lady and asked if she was no longer living like a black sheep. The young lady looked at her in surprise. She did not understand what she was talking about. In a society where children are judged by the titles of their parents, there was no point in the Marquis's daughter getting along with Vivian. Since Lilith was not part of Vivian's retinue, it is possible that she saw her true nature. Lilith looked at the young lady and asked with a smile if she wanted to have a drink together. Violet thought for a moment, as she had never drunk alcohol before. She knew that after she came into this world, she had not even tried alcohol, and yet she had been seriously injured a few days ago. She knew that health was more important than alcohol. The young lady smiled and said that she wouldn't mind having a little drink. It was the first time she had been offered a drink with a friend today, so it was a historic moment. On the other hand, Zen cried a lot because of the suspension. The young lady was very happy and had a great time. Lilith looked at her and said that she thought she had changed a lot since she got married. Lilith said that it was more precise and not long before the wedding with the crown prince. Lilith said that she was weak and pliable, but from that moment on, she became determined and firm, so she wanted to be friends with her very much. Lilith looked at her and asked if she liked being married. Lily said that her father said that she should choose one of the men and marry, since she is the only daughter in the family. He should pass the title to her son-in-law. Violet looked at her friend in surprise and asked if women couldn't inherit the title. Now she said that her father was too conservative. She said it was unfair to hand over the title to a husband who knew nothing about their family just because she was a woman. Lilith smiled and told Violet that her husband was very handsome. The young lady said that her husband was indeed handsome, and also asked her friend if she hadn't just said that she didn't want to get married. Lilith sighed heavily and said that everything depended on the person. A moment later, the young lady felt uneasy. Violet looked at her friend and said that she would now bring water. She was a little puzzled since this was the first time she dealt with a drunk person. She walked and looked for the servants. A moment later, someone grabbed her arm. The young lady looked in surprise at the prince who was holding her hand tightly. Violet looked at the prince in surprise and asked if it was polite to take someone by the hand and drag them. The prince said that it was difficult to get a chance to talk to her. She looked at him and said she didn't think he got it fair and square. The prince smiled and asked if it mattered. He said it was the chance itself that mattered. He smiled and did not ask her to come into his tent. Some time later, they were sitting at the table together. She understood that there were a lot of eyes in this place, and if their conversation dragged on, rumors might start to spread. She looked at him and asked why he wanted to meet her. The prince looked at her and said that everything was very strange. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she had avoided meeting him so much. He said that usually everyone lined up to talk to him. He looked at her and asked if she really thought that if their conversation dragged on, there would be some kind of problem. The young lady wondered if he could see right through her, or if he suspected her of something. In the game, it became active after she married the crown prince, as she worked as a spy to steal information, but things went wrong when she chose a different fate. So now the Duke is the only absolute ally for the prince who can give him advice, but the Duke does not even suspect that the young lady has changed. She understood that the prince's suspicions were not nurtured by the Duke, but that he had thought of everything himself. The young lady looked at the prince and said that he was certainly attractive, but she was already married. He looked at her and asked with a smile if she had not married under duress. He said that she could have become the crown princess. He asked if she didn't feel sorry to lose such a place. She was shocked and asked questions about what was happening to her. She wondered if he really wanted to seduce her. The prince looked at her and said with a smile that he was not as kind to everyone as he was to her. She saw that he was trying to gain her favor in order to then force information out of her. She realized that he seemed to think she was still the same silly simpleton. She looked at him with a smile. She still wanted to listen to what he was trying to find out from her. The prince smiled and asked if they would be friends. Now he said that one should share secrets with friends, and he also wanted to share secrets with her. The prince asked her if her husband had spoken about anyone recently, for example, a young woman. The young lady realized that he was looking for a priest. She smiled and said that her husband had not spoken to him about anything like that. The prince said that there is always a woman next to a man, and she just needs to think carefully. Violet realized that Edil thought the councilwoman had abandoned him and joined the archduke. She realized that it was probably because the time when he was actively showing himself and using the order coincided. But with the disappearance of the advisor, she was shocked since she did not know that he would be so actively looking for her. She wondered if he really thought she was stupid, since he so calmly said that her husband was cheating on her. But still, she was satisfied with his primitive way of thinking. She smiled and said that since this was her friend's request, she would watch what was happening more closely. She said that she needed to bring water to her friend, and therefore she needed to go. The prince meekly agreed with her and let her go. But in turn, he stared after her. Violet was puzzled, as she did not expect such a development of events. She understood that he was desperate, but she still knew that everything was fine. And even if he thought that she had fallen for his tricks, she understood that she could take advantage of his gullibility. A moment later, she saw her friend rushing towards her. The young lady was taken aback and asked her friend for forgiveness, as she had forgotten to bring water. She said that she would bring it. Now Lilith smiled and said that she in turn will try, ran away again. Lilith smiled and said that they didn't need water, and they could drink. Violet was shocked. She didn't know how much her friend had drunk while she was gone. Violet told Lilith that she was drunk, but she in turn denied everything. Lilith shouted that until they all drank, Violet would not go anywhere. Violet was shocked because she didn't expect this. Violet sighed heavily as they had finally finished drinking everything. Looking around, she saw many people who were dead drunk or were lying on the ground. Violet was shocked because she didn't know her friend could drink so much. Violet knew that all the guards had long since left, and so she would have to lead her herself. The Marquis of Marbella asked the Archduchess for forgiveness and said that they had shown great disrespect towards her. The young lady looked at the Marquis and said that everything was fine, since thanks to her friend, she had a good time. He looked at her and said that it was good if so, but the world has its own rules that must be followed. The Marquis looked at his subordinate and told him to look up in the laws of the empire what compensation was due in this case. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she did not need anything. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that it looked like she wanted to personally punish his daughter. Violet looked at him puzzled and said that she did not want anything like that. She smiled and said that he would just leave. The Marquis looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she was still drunk. He could not let her go alone and said that he would certainly assign a servant to her. The young lady smiled and said that she was already completely sober. The Marquis looked at her in surprise. The young lady was surprised and did not understand what had suddenly happened to the atmosphere. Violet looked at the Marquis and said with a smile that she was perfectly fine enough to be able to tell for sure that there were no buttons on the Marquis's clothes. The Marquis looked at her in surprise. He was stunned since he was obsessed with buttons. The Marquis shouted that walking alone under the influence of alcohol was very dangerous. Violet did not understand what the problem was, since the sun had already risen long ago. The Crown Prince approached them and asked if they had any problems. The lady turned around as she heard a familiar voice. A moment later, she saw the Crown Prince in all his glory before her. The Marquis shouted to the Crown Prince that the Archduchess was drunk, but wanted to go alone to her tent. Violet said that she was perfectly fine and asked the prince to clear up the misunderstanding. The prince smiled and told the young lady that if she did not want to burden the Marquis, he could take her there. She looked at him and said that in her right mind, she could not go there on her own. He looked at her and asked if it would be okay for Togo to walk with him to the tent and prove his point along the way. She smiled and asked if he thought she couldn't do it. She said that she would certainly prove it to him and told him to follow her. He smiled and said that he was coming. Sometime later, as they both walked towards the tent, the prince looked at his companion and said that they were on the other side. The young lady smiled and said that it didn't matter whether she was drunk or sober. She was not very good at orienting herself, so it was all right. She looked at him and asked if he was laughing at her. The prince said that he smiled because she was right. He said that she really wasn't drunk with a smile on his face. Now she understood why he was the first suitor in the empire. He was very handsome and at the same time not intoxicated by his power. She saw that he was a man who radiated warm energy. The prince looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he broke the awkward atmosphere. The prince looked at the young lady and asked if she was happy with her marriage. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was suddenly asking such a thing. He said that if everything went well, he would marry her. She looked at him and said that it was wrong to make senseless assumptions and ask such questions. The prince looked at her son with a smile on his face. He said that she was suddenly giving a sane answer again. The young lady said that she had long since returned to normal. He laughed and said that he was wrong again. She looked at him in bewilderment. The prince smiled and said that while they were having a nice conversation, they had already come to her tent. The young lady smiled and said that in that case she would leave him. The prince looked after her and said that if she ever wanted to free herself from the forced marriage, he could help her. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why he needed this. She looked at him intently and said that she would sort out her own affairs. She felt a little uneasy as she knew that the prince did not know all the details, but she didn't understand why he had such a face, as if he regretted something. The prince said he never really felt any regret about it. He said that such a decision was nothing more than a strategy, so he thought that it did not matter to him who he married. But now, for the first time, he regrets that everything went wrong. The young lady froze in place. A moment later, the Archduke approached them and said that they needed to finish this. Cedric said it would be better to end the conversation, which could cause misunderstandings. The prince smiled and said that this was not a conversation of that kind, but rather about the past. The prince said that the young lady was a little drunk, so he decided to accompany her to the tent. But since the Archduke was already here, he would go. The young lady smiled and said that she was not drunk at all, and that her husband had a lot of buttons on his clothes. Cedric looked at his wife with surprise and confusion. He sighed heavily and said that she was drunk. After all, the prince smiled and said that he had spoken about this earlier. A moment later, the couple said goodbye to the prince. Violet sat down on the chair and sighed heavily. She wanted to sleep. Cedric looked at her and asked if she wanted some water. She looked at him and said that she thought he had also drunk a lot, but he looked well. He smiled and said that those with whom he drank yesterday had collapsed and left early. He looked at her and asked who she had been drinking with. Violet said that she had been drinking with Lady Lilith. The young lady smiled and said that she was the Marquise's only daughter. She looked at her husband and told him everything that had happened between them. Cedric looked at his wife and asked if it was true. He said that it seemed like she had not been drinking with the crown prince. Violet looked at him in surprise, as she didn't understand what he was talking about. She looked at him and said that she seemed to be a little drunk, as she was seeing all sorts of nonsense. Cedric looked at her in surprise and asked what exactly she was seeing. She looked at her husband and said that she saw him smiling sweetly, as he usually did not do that. A moment later, he burst out laughing. The young lady froze in place. He said that everything was correct and she was drunk and was now seeing only illusions. But still, she stared at him and wondered why it all felt so real. He looked at her and asked why she was looking at him so intently, without taking her eyes off her husband. The young lady said that he was very handsome. Cedric looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true. Violet asked if he didn't know. He looked at her and said with a smile that he didn't know about it, since no one had ever appreciated his appearance before. She sighed heavily and said that in that case, she would tell him everything as it was. She came closer to him and said that he was very handsome. He smiled and said he wanted her to be drunk every day. She asked in surprise if he really liked drunk women. He smiled and said that he liked that she had become more honest. She said she was always honest with him. Cedric said that wasn't true. Cedric said that she was open, but not completely honest, and was always hiding something. She looked at him and said with a smile that he had secrets too. She said he had reasons for going to a different estate every full moon, or for the tranquilizers he took. She looked at him and said that each of them was hiding something. He said that he understood everything, but his secrets were very dark and dangerous. She was puzzled and did not understand why he always drew a line between them. The young lady looked at him and said that no matter what secrets he had, she would not run away anywhere, so he should not worry about it.